began with the Kindred, the vampires of the Masquerade. They came to us in 1991 with the mega-hit tabletop role-playing series Vampire the Masquerade. Within a decade, the creators, White Wolf, had produced a juggernaut of a franchise about a world of darkly relatable monsters. Werewolves, wraiths, changelings, mages, and even the desperate rebels who hunted them all down. It was a world of darkness right from the beginning, and it took the world by the throat in the 90s. Since its glory days, the IP has mostly been known for its spin-off media. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is a gilded classic from the 2000s, and a long-awaited, but potentially catastrophic, sequel looms on the horizon at the time of recording. Last year, I introduced my audience to the world of darkness with a trio of games intended to bring people up to speed with the franchise's history and the kind of storytelling it was able to accomplish. This video is part of this year's Month of Darkness, a blast of 4 videos about the dark and gothic franchise that dominated the tabletop industry of yesteryear. This mega video contains all 3 of last year's World of Darkness videos, plus an interview with original White Wolf developer Richard Dansky, and a brand new retrospective conclusion at the end about what I think the World of Darkness needs to focus on in the modern day to make its struggling relaunch land a little better. For now, let's discover a world of darkness through the study of its video games. With Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, we'll talk about the astonishing heights the world of darkness reached in the 90s. In Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood, we'll get the chance to talk about the kind of rebellious, angry themes that made the setting so special, as well as what happened to the world of darkness that led it on a path of obscurity. Finally, in Wraith the Oblivion Afterlife, we're going to drill deep into one of these franchises to show you the breathtaking levels of storytelling and world building that the games were capable of. Now, before we dive into it fully, let me introduce you all to one of the writers who made this world of darkness possible. I've got here with me today the great Richard Dansky of various types of fame, especially notable here for his work on various White Wolf properties. But let's start with this. Richard, where else can they find you? What are you working on right now?
Well, for my day job right now, I am the franchise narrative director for the online shooter Hunt Showdown, which is a horror game set in the 1890s, whereby you hunt monsters for rewards and also hunters. So that is the day job. And then the evening, I write a lot of fiction. My most recent book was A Meeting in the Devil's House, which is a collection of short stories. And it's got things ranging from a story of zombie frogs, based on a true story, no less, to a man-eating Sasquatch in a top hat, to a magical pirate rabbi fighting zombies, to, well, let's just say I don't restrain myself in subject matter.
Which game lines did you work on? We know you were the lead of Wraith for a really long time, but did you touch on everything a little bit? Were you more on some lines than others?
The ones that I developed formally were Wraith, Mind's Eye Theater, Vampire the Dark Ages, Kindred of the East, and Werewolf the Wild West for the Ghost Towns project. I also contributed writing to Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, Changeling the Dreaming, a fair bit of stuff to Trinity when that property emerged, and pretty much wherever they needed me to go, I went. It was always new challenges and new exciting stuff to do.
And before we get too far into the actual topic today, we do have a dedication, don't we? We are dedicating the interview portion of this to the late James A. Moore, who died a few months ago.
Yes, James was a dear and close friend. He was established as a freelancer at White Wolf when I got there in 1995, and was very generous with his time and his learnings. He was a joy to work with. He had a ferocious style to his writing that absolutely fit some of what we were doing, and so it was the perfect melding of subject matter to author. And he and I maintained that friendship for the next, even after I left White Wolf, we stayed in touch. We would see each other at conventions, and he I don't call very many people brother, but with Jim I meant it.
We'll be returning to Richard Dansky throughout this video. If you want to hear the entire interview completely uncut, it's available as bonus content as part of my Patreon. This video is sponsored by you. The World of Darkness has never really shied away from spicier subject material, and to ensure that I had the full independent editorial control to cover those topics with the nuance and depth they required, I released the 3 videos originally completely sponsor-free. And for the re-release, we've done the same. If you want to support the channel and make sure that I never have to back down on covering difficult subject material, then the best way to do that is by supporting me on Patreon. And you do get something out of the deal. For starters, you get perks on my Discord, and you'll gain access to the hidden patron channels where I'm frequently hanging out. You'll also get previews of all of my videos before they come out, and top-tier patrons will even have early access to the video the night before. You'll even gain access to a full podcast that I do every month. I bring on guests to talk about video games, tabletop materials, and everything in between. This month, we brought on the channel's favorite OG World of Darkness grognard, Auntie Haunty. And we talked about where the World of Darkness has been, where it's going, and she took the opportunity to educate us on another one of World of Darkness's lesser-known lines, Changeling. If any of that sounds appealing to you, then head on over to Patreon. I literally could not do this without you guys. But now, I think it's high time we got to Vampire the Masquerade Redemption.
Just don't say I'm damned for all time. Where is Aniska?
Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is a legendary game that's known to be a cult classic. A flawed masterpiece, claim the YouTube thumbnails. The crown jewel of the entire IP, claims Paradox Interactive. But what you will not often hear about it is that when it comes to Vampire the Masquerade video games, it was not the first. No, the honor of being first goes to Vampire the Masquerade Redemption from 2000, and that's the game that we're going to be discussing today. Following the rules of the tabletop in that classic CRPG style, in a way that's honestly vastly different from the solo gameplay loop of Bloodlines. It's October, and that means we're shifting our attention away from Dungeons & Dragons video games and towards a different series of video games based off of the hit TTRPG series, The World of Darkness. Most tabletop gamers will have at least heard of this setting to some degree, but for the PC gamers in my audience, you may not know a whole lot about this IP. Likely you have heard of the 2004 video game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and you may also have heard that it was based off of a tabletop game by the same name. But what you may not have heard is just how deep this rabbit hole goes, or how influential and grandiose this property was back in its heyday. Vampire the Masquerade and the World of Darkness it inspired was messy, crude, and extraordinarily edgy, but it was also sincere in ways that were just intoxicating and contagious. It was a love letter to outcasts. Vampire the Masquerade inspired countless spin-offs from their company White Wolf, from werewolves and their apocalypse to the dark dreams of the changelings. But so too did it inspire countless books, spin-off media, a TV show, and even a real-world teenage vampire cult that murdered their parents. Through covering 3 video games, Werewolf, Vampire, and Wraith, we'll discover all about this intoxicating little system that so entranced the teens of the 1990s. While the connections between these different games can be messy and disconnected and honestly even flat-out contradictory on occasions, the one thing that they can all agree on is this: it was a world of darkness. The story of how we got to Vampire Redemption and its romantic melodrama begins 10 years earlier, at the beginning of the 90s. The great irony of the Satanic Panic's focus on claiming Dungeons & Dragons was encouraging teens to worship the devil and join cults is that they completely failed to pay any attention to the 1991 role-playing game by White Wolf, Vampire the Masquerade. In it, the players don't fight against the darkness as they do in Dungeons & Dragons. Instead, they embrace it. playing as a band of vampires, trying to find their way in the dark and hidden society of the Kindred. The idea came from a simple thought by creator Mark Reinhagen. He wanted to make a vampire game, but he found the idea of playing vampire hunters to be boring. Thus, Vampire the Masquerade was born, and was almost immediately a massive success, finding a target audience that was related, but altogether separate from the geeks that made up the bulk of the D&D audience. Vampire, and the world of darkness that grew around it, became the pastime of choice for an entire generation of goths. From the jump, this IP changed tabletop role-playing games forever, and in so many different ways. This game was probably the great harbinger at the time of simplified rule sets. No longer requiring hours of lecture from the DM to learn how to play, new fans could be up and running far, far quicker. Vampire the Masquerade was based on the Storyteller rule set, upon which all future World of Darkness games would be built as well. And while the actual rules of the Storyteller system are, in retrospect, something that even the most diehard of fans would admit are just not very good, the Masquerade didn't run on combat or crunchy mechanics in the way that old-school D&D did. Thus, lackluster rules weren't necessarily a big problem. This was a system that put narrative and storytelling at the front, with dungeon crawling forced to take a back seat. This storytelling focus granted levels of immersion that many players never quite achieved with Dungeons & Dragons. Plus, whether or not White Wolf intended this to be the case, there is kind of a sympathetic connection between the outcast goths who were playing this game and the brooding vampires forced to seclude themselves from human society. It should be little surprise that Vampire the Masquerade has always had a far greater number of players who chose to take things one step farther and take their game away from the table and play their games as live-action role-playing. In many countries, in fact, Vampire the Masquerade was the inciting event that brought LARP to their nation. In addition to their hobby-shaking contributions to storytelling, streamlining, and LARP, Vampire the Masquerade had one additional legacy that is likely more significant than any of the others. The popularity of Vampire the Masquerade with groups that weren't your traditional 90s and 80s nerd is oft cited as the inciting incident that finally brought women and girls flooding into the role-playing hobby. The exact reason for this is debated. Targeting goths as opposed to geeks in the 90s probably meant that you just innately had more women in your audience. Vampires could have just been a fantasy that better appeals to both genders. The truth is likely a mix of all of the above and even more factors. Women were always there in the hobby, with surveys showing that somewhere around 5% of D&D gamers were girls in the 1970s, yet it was White Wolf who truly succeeded at welcoming women in large numbers into the hobby, both on the ground amongst the player base, but also amongst their writing staff, with 11 of the 28 writers during the original World of Darkness run being women, which was practically unheard of at the time. This was a big stepping stone towards the modern demographics, where 40% of all Dungeons & Dragons players and presumably TTRPG players at large are women. But immediately after the success of Vampire, White Wolf began hungrily spinning off, launching a new game line about different monsters each year. Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, Wraith the Oblivion, Changeling the Dreaming. But then the calendar hit 1996, an auspicious year for this IP, and an important one on the stepping stone towards Vampire Redemption. Yes, this is still a video about this game. Don't worry, the review section is not far off. 1996 is when White Wolf made its play for the mainstream, releasing a Fox drama about the vampire clans of their masquerade, called Kindred the Embraced. In it, a lone detective discovers that the mobster he's been hounding is actually the vampire prince of San Francisco, and the two have to team up to prevent an all-out war between the city's 5 clans. The bad news is that this show only made it 7 episodes before being cancelled, mostly due to the fact that viewers at the time thought it was confusing and difficult to keep track of by 90s standards. The next major event in 1996 is one that probably would have gotten the TV series cancelled anyway. While the Satanic Panic mostly passed over White Wolf, they were about to run face first into it with the help of a band of troubled teenagers. Rod Farrell was a kid with a tough life. His parents had him way too young, and his dad ran off. To make matters worse, court documents claim that his grandfather was abusing him. And, probably abusing him that way. Rod eventually met a group in his small Kentucky town who played Vampire the Masquerade. This group was, it was on the more hardcore end of things, and they were having difficulty discerning the difference between reality and the game. Often, they drank each other's blood for real. Every member of their little band had intense scarring up and down their arms from this practice. Rod began to dive farther into the game with this group, and soon lost himself in the fantasy, managing to scare even the coterie that had inducted him. A good parent might have tried to pull their son back and given them some grounding from the delusions, but that's not what Rod's mom did. She began soliciting a 14-year-old boy in the group to embrace her so that she could be a vampire like her son. She was later jailed for this because it's exactly as bad as it sounds. Rod was booted out of this group after killing a cat and eventually fighting the leader of the band. Rod soon forged his own coterie, embracing a group of teenagers, including his girlfriend. The group decided to relocate themselves to New Orleans to be a dark family, but on the way they planned to pick up their friend Heather. Heather and Rod knew each other quite well, but Heather's family didn't think much of the strange goth boy Rod, who was constantly ranting about immortality. Having been forbidden from communicating with each other, Heather angrily overreacted, as teenagers understandably do, telling Rod that her parents were abusing her. All investigation on this case suggests that the parents were not, in fact, abusing her. She was simply upset with them. And, teenagers can be careless with their words. Except, she had just told this to Rod Farrell, an abuse victim who thought he was an immortal killer. So after picking up Heather to join their road trip to New Orleans, Rod and his right-hand man double back and bludgeon Heather's parents to death with a crowbar. Heather didn't know Rod had done this until the police caught up with the vampire family. All were sent to jail, tried as adults for the crime, with Rod given the death penalty at only 16 years of age, though this was later reduced to a life sentence. Heather, on the other hand, was not jailed. Her only crime in the end was not realizing how badly fucked up her friend Rod was. Now, while Vampire the Masquerade did get a mini moral panic after the Vampire Clan murder, the public was already kind of dulled on moral panics against role-playing games after, just going through a decade of them. Plus, many parents didn't actually know what Vampire the Masquerade was, so they just got mad at D&D again, cause that's the same thing, right? Now all of this, getting a TV series, the effect on the teenage psyche, shows you just how powerful of an IP Vampire is. But none of these spin-offs ever really reached the same level of success. Werewolf and Mage were popular enough to justify their existence, but titles like Wraith and Changeling didn't get that much traction. Vampire was always the star of the World of Darkness, and really was the cash cow that allowed the rest of the thing to even exist. So, with new spin-offs failing over and over, White Wolf took things in a different direction, producing a Vampire the Masquerade spin-off called Dark Ages, which serves as a prequel to the setting. Whereas the base Vampire the Masquerade is set in the modern day and has most clans working together to serve greater organizations like the Camarilla, the Sabbat, and the Anarchs, Dark Ages is set in a time before those pesky humans were strong enough to really threaten vampire society. There is no Camarilla, and there is no need for one, because there truly are no rules in vampire society. There are only the 13 clans, and the constant war between them for the control of the medieval world. And it is this setting that Vampire the Masquerade Redemption is set, at least in part. Because the great selling point of this game is that this is a story in two parts. You begin as a vampire in the Dark Ages, and then at the halfway point, the story shifts to allow you to play as the same vampire 900 years later in the year 1999. And this is an exciting concept. For a story like this, a tale of revenge stretching across 1,000 years is one that can only be told with the gothic melodrama of a world of darkness. Today's handsome bachelor is Christophe Romuald, a young crusading Frenchman. His personality can largely be summed up as... Christophe turned the tide of battle against a horde of pagans in Moravia, being gravely wounded by an arrow in the process. He returns to the world of the living a few days later, his crusading brothers having moved on. He's been attended to by a nun named Sister Anezka, and as you can see, they kinda like each other. That night, a strange monster attacks Anezka and the other nuns, and the wounded Christophe springs to action. Afterwards, we're given the choice to go save the day, or, maybe in like 5 more minutes or 2 months or something, some sleep might be nice. Now look, the only thing I know about Christophe thus far is... So therefore, we plunge headlong into an infested silver mine just outside the city. After hacking apart countless schlachtas and a war ghoul, we are confronted with a horrifying vampiress from Clan Simitsi. Hello, my name is Professor Sycamore Redwood Douglas Fir, and I'm here to wish you a warm welcome to the amazing world of Vampimon. From here on out, when you encounter a new clan of vampires, I'll update your Vampidex so you know who these wonderful creatures are. For example, Clan Simitsi is known as a Flesh Shaper type clan, strong against humans whom they dismiss as lesser. They excel at torture and the scaring of low-income Transylvanians. And yes, that's right, that means that Dracula himself was a Tsimitsi. Now, let's get back to the Tsimitsi at hand.
Out, blaspheming wretch! Taste the steel of righteousness!
We return to Prague as a hero, receiving lavish praise for our deeds. We also sneak in a little bit of flirtation, but we are immediately scolded for being too much of a heartthrob.
Such thoughts are evil! Thy concupiscence damns thy soul and dooms Aneska!
As penance, we're sent to patrol the streets at night to clear out yet more demons, who are strangely not appearing any less, despite the fact that we cleared out the mine. Upon doing so, Christophe, being so hot and desirable, finally catches up to him. Every vampire clan in the city is hoping to embrace the talented killer to strengthen their own standing. Our boy pours his heart out to Anezka, and they both narrowly avoid breaking Anezka's oath.
May God have mercy upon my soul, for the devil has just placed into my heart the most impure of notions.
Christophe tears himself away and starts walking pretty strangely down the street. We are soon accosted by one of the elders of a clan looking to expand their numbers.
Now come to me. I am the mother of thy rebirth.
I know thy ways, demon, and I have lore enough to kill thee.
Nay, thou art helpless in my hands as a naked babe.
Nay! Oh, nay!
Christophe awakens days later in his new home, the clan sanctuary of the Bruges.
God have mercy on my soul. I am damned.
Although immediately fearing for his soul, he has little choice but to hear them out. His new patriarch, the vampire who embraced him, is Ekaterina. What little comfort she can offer him is that he's now part of a clan that actually does have visions for a better world, where both kin and kine stand as equals. The Bruges trace their ancestry back to the ancient city of Carthage, which in World of Darkness lore was a city of rough equality between mortals and vampires. It was shattered, just as in our world, by Rome, and the soil was salted by Clan Ventru, that the Bruges dream would never live again. Ekaterina and her circle are part of a sect of Bruges called the Prometheans, and are devoted to bringing the ideals of Carthage back into the world. Anyways, Christophe is moping about his damnation and the fate of his eternal soul. His new brother in blood, Wilhelm, ein deutscher Vampir, decides to cheer him up by bringing us on a mission. You see, Clan Cappadocian, a clan friendly to the Bruges, has recently stolen important documents from Ekaterina. We are tasked with slaying as many Cappadocians as required to retrieve them, so long as we don't harm the head Cappadocian. Now, having access to vampire disciplines, a blood pool, and a second character, this is a good time to start digging into the gameplay. This is certainly in the BioWare school of CRPGs, but still a world apart due to its differing game system. Nevertheless, it's quite intuitive, and there is a staggering number of disciplines to choose from. In the end, not all that many of them are very useful though, so there's a limit on how many ways you can effectively build your character. After playing with it for a while, I chose to specialize Kristoff into being my blood drinker. The stunning of foes and the drinking of their blood is really kinda micro-heavy, so it just seemed logical to me to have my main character be the one to do it, then giving the blood away to my companions to keep them topped up on the lovely red mana. There does seem to be a few bugs though. We're instructed to never kill people when we feed, and that it will awaken our inner beast. But it's pretty much unavoidable that you'll accidentally do it from time to time, and nothing bad ever actually happens. Your frenzy doesn't increase, your humanity doesn't drop, so unless I'm missing something, I don't think they ever actually implemented that mechanic. While the gameplay as a whole does work, Vampire the Masquerade was never meant to be all that combat-oriented. But this game is, and to a surprising degree. It was apparently an in-joke, according to a few forum users, that the reason there are so few vampires in the modern day compared to the distant past is because Kristoff killed them all. Vampire just isn't meant to be a huge, great combat slog. It's meant to have role-playing at the front and center. But for what it's worth, Redemption isn't too awful of a combat fest. It's not obscenely difficult, and while the dungeons are just a little bit too long and too samey, we're nowhere near intolerable levels of either. And for that matter, for a BioWare-style game, it's really quite linear. There's not much in the way of choice, mainly differing dialogues that can raise or lower your humanity, this affecting which armor you can use and which endings you have access to. None of this detracts, however, from the game's biggest strength, its atmosphere. The story does have some structural problems for reasons I'll explain later, but it always manages to feel good to just be Kristoff. Anyway, we find the Cappadocian thief, a young protege who was acting without orders. We slay him to retrieve the stolen goods. Wilhelm allows us a quick visit with Inezka so we can get our head in the game. But this was only after literally every other Promethean told Kristoff that this was an awful idea. And frankly, me, William SRD, I'm agreeing, it was a bad idea. Kristoff tells Inezka of his fate, and the brave girl swears to us that she shall not rest until she's found a cure for Kristoff. We then have another task to do before we can call it a morning. We head into a Jewish neighborhood to stop the frenzied golem that the renegade Cappadocian from earlier had sicked on them. The community is saved, and the head Cappadocian makes his appearance. He's saddened by the bloodshed, but he is glad to be rid of the troublemaker. As an apology for all of this, he sends his daughter Serena off with us to serve Clan Bruja. Anyway, we sleep through the day and some time passes. We are overcome by a dream that Inezka was attacked by Kristoff and then fed upon. Kristoff goes to check up on her, and indeed finds her bedchambers in the abbey to be empty. Reporting into Ekaterina, we are informed that Inezka gave the Prometheans a note, forsaking her oaths as a nun, so that she may instead try to save Kristoff from damnation. Her location is unknown, but she's presumed missing. Many Bruja and their allies have also been disappearing lately, and Kristoff is tasked with helping them investigate, hoping to find Inezka with them. Ekaterina takes us to the Ventru Prince of the city, Rudolf Brandl. Now, we're Bruja, so he hates us, and he's part of the clan that burned Carthage down, so we hate him right back. But he is still the prince, and that means we have to give him some respect, and he has to keep the peace and not let vampires get kidnapped left and right in his city. He will tell us what happened if we do him a favor and steal a relic. To get to this relic, we have to prowl through Nosferatu tunnels below the city. The game forces us to learn about niche abilities that help us see our enemies when they go invisible. Failure to utilize these abilities means that we're going to be paying for it in major amounts of attrition, and difficulty keeping the party's blood levels above the bare minimum. It's a good little section, and soon we have the relic for that Ventru trash. He redirects us to the man who has been rounding up Bruja, a freaky little Tremere named Arden. As we raid his secret base, we free a gangrel named Eric, who agrees to come with us and complete our little party of 4. The Tremere are a new clan, and are ecstatic about trying out their new magic on us, but we do in the end make it to Ardan. He's a little creep, with all the tact of a disgusting little brother who's telling you about these dirty magazines he's obsessed with. Except his obsession is Anezka. However, Arden wasn't much on the vampiric totem pole, and he wasn't actually allowed to embrace the captive nun. The story of what he did about the situation is both convoluted and muddled, but in the end we find out that she was sent in a slave caravan led by a man named Orsi and headed to Vienna. "You're absolutely not going to Vienna," says Ekaterina. "The Bruja have no presence there, and she's definitely not going to waste talented Prometheans like Christoph on an impossible task. But you know what? Ekaterina may be our patriarch, but she's not my real mom."
Brazen brat!
On the way, I reflect a little bit on the game so far, and especially on the presentation of all this. Now, don't be fooled by how bad the textures are by today's standards. This was top of the line in 2000. One outlet at the time even called it the best looking RPG ever made. While this is obviously subjective, it's true that Redemption had a wonderful intersection of gothic art direction and cutting edge graphical tech. It was well ahead of its BioWare peer, Baldur's Gate 2, and BioWare wouldn't catch up to Redemption graphically until probably at least Neverwinter Nights 2002, but more defensively Coder in 2003. And even then, BioWare wasn't definitively beating Redemption's graphics until Jade Empire in 2005, after our boy Christoph had finished up his adventure for a full half-decade. The voice acting was also excellent, with all the leads sounding perfect and delivering their gothic Shakespearean believably.
"I shall discharge my life boon by accompanying the brave Bruja, who pried open the jaws of the Tremere trap and released poor Eric."
Where Christoph goes, Serena goes. Mayhap 4 shall prevail where 1 cannot.
Our party arrives, Vienna, Österreich. I will be brief about our little journey over here, cause it's quite short. Orsi, another greedy Ventru, agrees to tell us where Anezka is if we pay him off with a favor because these damned Ventru are all the same. We help him kill a priest turned vampire, which is a pretty cool dungeon because we have to do it during the day. It's stick to the shadows or get burned. In the end, Orsi does not keep his promise, and he throws us into the prison of the Teutonic Knights. Fortunately, Serena is able to get us out due to how careless the Teutons are with their trash. We know enough after all this to know that the caravan Orsi led went to another group of Tremere in this city called the Dehexi. We raid the estate and find their leader, Etrius. Unfortunately, the powerful elder warps Eric's body and we're forced to slay him. Afterwards, we rain vengeance down upon the proud vampire lord, and in the end he's absolutely humiliated and surrenders to avoid further shame.
"I have suffered the maddening serenity of the dying salute, but I will not suffer further indignity at the hands of a fledgling Bruja and his ragtag brigade."
What he tells us is the worst possible news. The slave caravan never actually reached Vienna. The Tzimisce raided it just outside of Prague. Anezka never even left the city. Prague is much changed when we return. Months or weeks have likely passed on the round trip south. Ekaterina has made her power play to take the city for the Prometheans. With our coterie touring Austrian wine country, our patriarch needed to be clever with her tactics to unseat the Ventru and the local Tzimisce. She managed to rile up all the local humans in a great witch hunt, slaughtering Prince Brandel and surrounding the Tzimisce in Viscerad Castle. Anezka is in all likelihood locked in with the flesh-tearing vampire clan, and has been for some time. The castle and its denizens are nightmares to behold, but they're no match for our talented little party of fellows. We learn that the lord of this castle is a long-exiled Tzimisce Methuselah named Vukodlak. He's bad even by their standards, which is why he's been exiled to Prague instead of living in the Carpathian heartlands. He schemed to gather enough power to one day prevent Gehenna, which is the vampire apocalypse. In the Gehenna, the 13 vampires who the clans descend from, also known as the Antediluvians, will rise and drain their descendants dry so that they may begin again. Vukudlok's plan is simple. Drain the Antediluvians dry and become the unparalleled god among the kindred. But this was a bit too ambitious for his clan. So they locked him up here, slumbering in eternal torpor. But on this day of all days, he can finally wake up, with the assistance of this lovely nun he captured and turned into a ghoul. Before Kristoff can snap her out of it, the ceiling collapses, burying the would-be god, and also our coterie.
Good work, brother. I'll alert Father Alatius that it's arrived. Then we can open it.
Kristoff, arise. Thou art in grave danger.
1999. Though, I suppose not the 1999 that I remember. Kristoff awakens to find that the world was not as he last saw it. He was buried in stasis, in torpor for centuries. When next he wakes, it's in a strange lab, surrounded by artifacts excavated from Viscerad Castle. Something, or someone, has called Kristoff back from his slumber. But finding out who is a task for later. More importantly, standing before our confused and starving crusader is a man who claims to be a vampire hunter. Which is the wrong thing to say to a livid and starving 900-year-old elder vampire.
Back off, sucker! I'm sending you to hell!
My name is Kristoff Romuald. I was a man of God and a soldier in heaven's cause. I am now outcast of heaven, and not even a man. I am kindred. I am a vampire.
The Vampires and Their Society of Leopold is a really fun segment. Not only is it great to be the dark creature that you never should have woken up, but it's also fascinating to see random clutter and objects that we recognize from our medieval journeys positioned as though they're artifacts of study. It's a pretty well-placed link between past and present, and it really shows off just how much the world has changed. Kristoff is able, against all odds, to glean some information from the scattered computers, even without grandchildren to call for help. It seems that Ekaterina's little power play in Prague has had some unintended consequences over the centuries. These humans she tricked into helping her kill Ventru and Tzimisce suddenly realized that it's possible for them to kill vampires if they team up, which was probably not the lesson we meant them to take from this. These now experienced hunters passed around their knowledge and assisted in founding a large number of orders of vampire slayers that were eventually merged together into the Inquisition. That meant that our actions in Viscerad were some of the pivotal events that led to vampires no longer being capable of acting in the open. The world has changed. It is now humans who rule the world of darkness. Terminals in the Society Lodge remark that the Tzimisce excavated much of the castle as well, and have been moving vast quantities of the soil from the site through London, where we now are. Our only lead is that the followers of Set are involved, but that's about all we've got to go off of. We head out the doors and into the streets of London, and Kristoff realizes that he probably shouldn't run around looking like a vengeful monster for very long. A guy attempts to mug us, and we allow him to live in exchange for a change of clothes he's carrying in his gym bag. We have gone from Dark Crusader to pissed off Revenant to, I don't know, somebody's dad? In efforts to link back up with Kindred Society, we find a vampire bar. We are fortunate enough to meet a descendant of Clan Bruja there. But they're certainly not the type of vampires that Kristoff used to be accustomed to. Pink is a London punk to his core, and he thinks that our archaic ass is just about the funniest thing he's ever seen.
You must be a fossil!
The Prometheans are all long dead, he explains, and without them, the Bruja have become lost. The spirit of anger and rebellion at a society gone wrong is pretty much all they've got left. There are no more lofty ambitions or visions of utopia. just the burning rage of anger at the world. Most of the clans in this modern era have put aside their differences and come together to form an organization called the Camarilla, which exists to enforce a masquerade which keeps kindred society hidden from mortals. Which is interesting in this game. With base Vampire the Masquerade being set in the modern day, the Camarilla is the status quo, and old clan rivalries from centuries before are the weird foreign wrench in the system. This game sets it up with the reverse being true. We are the ones coming into this with all the clan rivalries. Work with the Tremere? Those slaving fucks who took Inezca? The Ventru who never helped us without asking the impossible in return? Regardless, we pour our heart out to Pink, which definitely shouldn't be this funny.
Christoph Romuald, once of the Order of the Sword Brethren, once a Promethean Bruja, and now I know not what.
Pink agrees to help us and points us to a brothel that the Setites we're looking for are using as a front. But first, he helps us access an arms seller, desperately trying to convince us to stop using a damned sword. Fool! This is the Einkorn blade! Its edge has tasted the blood of hundreds! Now, take me to yon modern blacksmith! Strange men in vans truly are the artisans of our time. With Pink better armed, on my dime, and Christoph now equipped with some reasonable modern armor, we head out to infiltrate the followers of Set. At the front, we find a Toreador vampiress named Lily, who is not there of her own free will. Honestly, it was one of the biggest plot twists in the game when she opens her mouth and the voice of Tara Strong falls out.
I'm from Clan Toreador.
Prove it. Who are Cry Cry Cry?
You mean the American band Cry Cry Cry? Aren't they that acoustic trio that even though they're all songwriters only does covers of songs by other groups and performs the most depressing?
Enough! She's a Tory, all right.
She offers to help us if we assist her in breaking her bond to the Setite leader, Lucretia. The Toreador are one of the only clans that didn't massively fuck over Christoph in the Middle Ages, so we happily agree to help. We soon sneak into the Setite temple beneath the brothel and begin to do as Christoph does best. At the final lair we find the leader who, okay, let's just admit it, tragically was designed in the year 2000 and thus missed the dawn of the cosplay age by about 10 years. She refuses to help us and we're forced to kill her. It doesn't stick though, because Setites like to follow lit rules by cutting out their own hearts and storing them in a safe place. We have to backtrack and reach the Tower of London to get her fleshy phylactery. It's honestly a filler dungeon, especially when the devs could have just hid Lucretia's heart somewhere in the Setite temple. We return to Lucretia, threaten her, and then give her her heart back.
Pink, thou shalt return her heart.
Okay. Yeah.
What? She, of course, still betrays us. Before she died, Lucretia told us of a shipping vessel that the Giovanni family has been using to smuggle this Viscerad dirt in, and the boat is headed to New York, New York. The modern day has been quite fun so far, and the whole time skipped has been delivered excellently. In particular, I find the dialogue to be a really strong aspect of this. It seems strange at first that the medieval era fully committed to all the doths and the thous and etc., but seeing it contrasted with the modern day has been such a nice and immersive touch. We immediately feel the difference in the people we're speaking to, and we get this lovely contrast as Christoph still speaks in soliloquies, and Pink replies with, "You fucking what, mate?" Our medieval ass departs London on the cargo ship, and we discover a group of Interpol agents who've been slaughtered by some Nosferatu. I love the modern Nosferatu, by the way. They're like demonic guys who wear like obey hats and crap. It's incredible. We steal the IDs of the Interpol agents, and Lily is able to adjust them to look like us. Thus, when we get off the boat, we link up with our FBI contact. He's about to raid the Giovanni base where the Viscerad excavation stuff has been shipped, but he won't let us in on the raid. We pivot and commit to learning where the Giovanni base is on our own. The only ones who seem to know are the FBI, so we've got to get at their computer. We rescue a Nosferatu named Samuel, who's a lot less into Ed Hardy than his peers. He joins our party and directs us to a Malkavian hacker. The hacker sends us into the sewers to get at an access point below ground that he can use to infiltrate the FBI computer. The tunnels, like the ones we remember from Prague centuries ago, are filled to the top with Nosferatu, but this time they work for the Sabbat. We know from Pink that the Sabbat are a faction that rejects the Masquerade and the rules of the Camarilla. They're probably not explicitly evil by vampire standards, as they're mainly about not pretending to be something they aren't, but they're certainly evil by human standards, no longer maintaining rules about killing mortals or keeping hidden. Kristoff doesn't like them much because he's pretty attached to his humanity, so we get in another round of vamp hunting and slay the dreaded Underprince and his albino alligators. Now connected to the network, we track the FBI raid and follow them to the Giovanni hideout, who, much to the agent's surprise, are all vampires. They're a tough group, being the stronger inheritor of the now extinct clan Cappadocian we were allied with in the past. The boss deems this conflict to be unprofitable, so he's prepared to tell us everything. But before he gets the chance, Pink kills him. Kristoff is understandably confused and angry that Pink just sabotaged our whole investigation. But a familiar face, straight from the history books, emerges from a shadow to explain.
Because Pink is a liar and an assassin.
Wilhelm, God hath blessed me with thy return.
Kristoff, you can't trust Pink. He's an assassin from Clan Assamite.
Accusations are thrown out, Wilhelm telling us that Pink is an Assamite agent, hired by the Tzimisce to throw us off the trail of Vukodlak. Pink counters with the fact that Wilhelm is an agent of the Sabbat. Wilhelm says, yeah, this is true, and Kristoff is not happy about it. A small number of Prometheans are still alive, and they don't share the goals of the Camarilla. The rules of the Masquerade were put in place to cultivate a separate vampire society that is hidden from humanity, but ultimately lording over as much of it as they can. The Prometheans, however, haven't given up on their dream of a perfect society of kind and kin as conscious equals. They've thrown in with the Sabbat for now, but it's an alliance of convenience, and they certainly don't agree with the Sabbat's latest scheme of waking up Vukodlak to fulfill his 1,000-year-old doomsday plan. Pink finally drops his accent and mocks us before making his escape. It's a painful betrayal. I love the dynamic between he and Kristoff. But Wilhelm is here instead, and Ekaterina has instructed him to assist us in preventing the rise of the Great Methuselah once more. Our investigation hasn't fully dead-ended, however, and we stumble across a note remarking on how profitable the dirt shipments have been with Orsi Industries. That miserable fuck. Today is New Year's, and the millennia shall turn over into Y2K. This is the day that Vukodlak shall rise. Orsi Corp is a breeze after all we've been through, and soon we've finally got that wretched Ventru by the throat. We're too late, he informs us. The ritual has already begun. We make good on a 9-century-old promise of revenge. And Orsi's daughters, ashamed, tell us how to find Vukodlak's Cathedral of Flesh. We rush to the church basement where the Methuselah has been psychically orchestrating his awakening. And here she is. After all this time, Anezka is alive. Kristoff thought that it must have been her that woke him for the task.
Is this true, Anezka?
Dear master, please allow me to split Kristoff's joints and fleshcraft his bones into a throne for thy glory.
This is where the big choice of the game comes up. There are 3 endings, each available to you depending on how much of Kristoff's humanity is intact. I was human as hell, so I only had access to the good ending, in which I reject Vukodlak's demands that I join him on his quest to drain the antediluvians.
One antediluvian is no better than 13. I cannot entrust such power unto any, let alone thee.
We skirmish with the creature before he dismisses us, casting us down into the bowels of his rotten church. But this Cathedral of Flesh was not built by the Methuselah's own hands. How could it be? He was asleep. No, this place was built by Anezka, every decaying victim fused to the walls by her hand. And down here is where she locked her darkest memories, those parts of herself that she could not afford her master to see. We learn that she fought hard to resist, but her body was not in her control. The wicked Samitsi took great pleasure in turning the nun into a murderer and a sadist. After a century as a ghoul, she found only one thing she could do to resist: trick him into thinking she'd given in. She did his dirty work willingly, defiling her soul as she killed the innocent and built them into a cathedral for her master. But she sabotaged him in ways that he wasn't prepared to counter. She knew that he was a jealous, narcissistic creature and took full advantage of this flaw by whispering suspicions in his ear about every competent minion and operative that served him, delaying his rise by centuries as he repeatedly purged his ranks of anyone useful. Likewise, she elevated idiots like Orsi. Her crown jewel was when she convinced the Methuselah to abandon the old world entirely, spending centuries transferring his base of operations to America. Her great game couldn't last forever though, and when she could no longer delay the awakening, she did the only thing she could: waking Kristoff from his slumber. The one who thwarted Vukodlak in the Dark Ages was the only man who could hope to stop him now. We ascend back to the main chamber, content this time in our knowledge that the real Anezka is still alive within the ghoul. Vukodlak at last stops playing with his food, shifting into his combat form to attack us. Fortunately, Kristoff has grown powerful in his bloody disciplines, and I'm able to stunlock the giant and win the battle once and for all. Anezka was a ghoul, not a vampire, so with the death of her master, she doesn't have long to live. She tells Kristoff that she's sorry, but Kristoff rightfully admits that this was truthfully all his fault. And I remind all of you that he's completely correct. Everyone told him to not go hang out with Anezka as a vampire, 'cause look what happens. Still clinging to her faith after all these years, Anezka presumes herself damned after all that she's done to survive. There is one solution, however, to stave off final death.
Anezka, my accursed soul trembles to utter these selfish, blasphemous words. But thou need not die if thou wouldst endure.
Thou would still have me, Kristoff? I scarcely dared hope.
Thy love has redeemed me across 1,000 years. I would that I could offer salvation in return, but I have none to give, only damnation.
Damnation with thee would be sweet as salvation. Let thy love cast me down and raise me up forever. Take me, my love.
This was a pretty neat game. The story was fun, even if the story structure was a bit of a mess. This thing was written by a tabletop designer, and it shows. The plot feels like a 4-part tabletop role-playing game campaign where you buy a standalone book for each segment. While overall I would say that the narrative of this game is, in the positives, the pacing is all over the place. Nevertheless, it's an easy recommend for me. I'm already itching to replay it sometime and have Kristoff be rebuilt as a pure caster. I didn't expect much from a small and mostly forgotten game like Vampire Redemption, but I was so surprised at how good it was. But while much of the gaming world forgot about this 2000 title, White Wolf has not. The current incarnation of the IP is owned by Swedish developer Paradox Interactive, who are best known for their grand strategy titles like Stellaris, Hearts of Iron, and Europa Universalis. With this in mind, they've taken a wide approach to the IP, clearly taking some cues from Games Workshop in the way that they aim to build the franchise as a multimedia operation. And these many media spin-offs, podcasts, video games, novels, new editions of the tabletop, they haven't forgotten where the World of Darkness began. And they've not forgotten a piece of early spin-off media like Vampire the Masquerade Redemption. Kristoff and Ekaterina have reappeared numerous times over the years, with both being notable characters in the visual novel games that have been coming out recently. We also have confirmation that Serena survived both the collapse of Viscerod and the fall of House Cappadocia. She's mentioned briefly in a sourcebook as now belonging to Clan Hecata. And this leads into one of the game's other legacies. Look, this is an old Vampire the Masquerade game, You didn't think there weren't going to be mods, did you? Age of Redemption is probably the most popular and important one. It quashes bugs, implements missing mechanics, and if you want, it optionally adds Serena back to the game as a 1999 companion, since, we know she's confirmed alive. And the best part, Age of Redemption reportedly managed to set things up so that you can run the main campaign with some friends as a co-op game. I'll drop a link to the mod down below. The other big thing to talk about is how a team of modders are actually remaking this game in the Skyrim engine. The project is called Redemption Reawakened. It looks quite well done, even if I'm a bit skeptical of the change from party-based RPG to, Skyrim. Before we swap over to Werewolf, let's hear from Richard Dansky. I asked him what it was like to be part of White Wolf. What was it like being the in-studio of the decade, creating a game that had captivated thousands?
Functionally, it meant we got pestered a lot for party invites at conventions. But in terms of what it meant day-to-day in the studio, we were all, to a greater or lesser extent, aware of the fact that the stuff we were doing was really having an impact on people. I think one of the great things about Vampire and the rest of the World of Darkness was that it was a game that people could really find themselves in and say, I am a Lasombra, a Ventru, a Bruja, whatever. And there was that level of personal identification that came from getting away from the wargaming roots of tabletop role-playing and focusing more on social stuff and focusing more on character in a way that really hadn't been seen before. There was, I won't say a competition within the studio, but we were always trying to sort of push ourselves to be better and do better and better work, knowing that there were people out there who were so invested in it. More about the people who were writing and saying, hey, I was in a really dark place and playing Vampire helped me get out of it. And that continued on, actually. When I was announced as the developer for Wraith's 20th Anniversary Edition, I started to get emails from people saying things, that Wraith had helped them out of a mental health crisis, that Wraith, in some cases, they felt saved their life. And, that's obviously incredibly humbling. And it's a tremendous responsibility as well. But it all goes back to that early sense of identification that people had in the game, and the fact that they felt it was a kind of safe space to explore stuff that they maybe were having trouble with in real life, and identifying with. I won't say we were sitting there trying to create art, because that's, we were crazy kids in our 20s and whatnot, and just trying to explore this art form, or explore this form as best we could and tell the best stories and make the best books we could. But I feel that there was some genuine artistry that went into it. There was, the conception of the books themselves to make them beautiful. The prose trying to do things in game writing that had not been done before. And I will say, we were ambitious. We were very ambitious.
I think that really shows with the work you guys put on display. But so in regards to pushing boundaries, one of the things I want to talk about is, so World of Darkness, of course, came out kind of on the tail end of the Satanic Panic. I was always wondering how much of how much of the panic was on the team's mind at the time. Was it sort of something you guys were consciously thinking about, railing against? Did it affect how you guys wrote at all?
It did not affect how we wrote at all. We were determined to do what we wanted to do and do it right. There was that one weird moment when the quote-unquote vampire murders happened.
Right.
And that, the reality TV shows came to the White Wolf studio looking for a story, and I was actually put in charge of our response to that. So to try and set the record straight, I arranged for a LARP in the office with several local, vampire LARPers, and got them all costumed up and showing off the mechanics. And we were doing this, and two of the bigger guys involved in the scenario were role-playing their hearts out, bless them, and got into a very heated argument. And you could see the reporter from, I think it was America's Most Wanted, I'm not sure, getting more and more excited as, the tension is building. And then finally they come to combat and they whip out their rock, paper, scissors, whap, whap, whap. And I turn to her and I distinctly hear her say, "Oh fuck, they're just a bunch of nerds." A ton of fun stories. It was a crazy environment, and everybody did their own thing in a lot of ways. And people bring their dogs into the office. People walk around barefoot. One developer got offended by the barefootness, and so he came in without pants one day instead. It was a really interesting place, and we believed in what we were doing. We really believed in it.
And this has been the World of Darkness as it used to be. Let's get into Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood and discover what would happen over time. How would the World of Darkness develop? And where did it go for all those years it was missing?
It's high time they understood. Nobody attacks Endrin. Nobody.
Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood is a 2021 video game that just isn't very good. And most discussion of the game ends there, with maybe a few added references to the tabletop versions of the game mixed in. And if you're looking for me to challenge that narrative, well, I'm not really going to. All the reviews are completely correct about this game, and for all of the reasons that they cite. Shoddy graphics, boring and tonally dissonant gameplay, and a really lackluster narrative. But even so, this game is not a standalone piece of work, and because of that, there's still plenty to discuss in terms of what this game is, what its existence says about Paradox Interactive's approach to the World of Darkness franchise, and also the story of how this game came to be after 2 decades of cancelled Werewolf the Apocalypse video games. So let's start with that. How did we get here? What is Werewolf the Apocalypse? Welcome back to my 3-part series on the World of Darkness video games. Last week, we discussed Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, and we also covered the broad strokes of what the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop system was, and the intricacies of what Vampire Society entails in that game. But one thing you'll notice if you look too hard at Vampire the Masquerade is just how urban it is. Most vampires stick to the cities, and this isn't just because that's where their prey is. There's another reason too. Another reason that the kindred prefer boats and air travel to highways and back roads. It's because of the teeth and the claws that guard those places. It's because of the werewolves. This is how the World of Darkness functions. The game lines are parallel but disconnected. To a player of Vampire the Masquerade, the werewolves are merely a wilderness threat, a reason to not wander outside of city limits. But to the werewolves who call themselves the Garou, the vampires are in fact nothing more than the least important of all their worm-tainted enemies. The werewolves aren't cursed humans the way that vampires are. They are an entirely separate species created by Gaia herself to protect nature from the impending apocalypse. They are the gnashing teeth and rending claws of Mother Nature, our planet's first and last defense against the apocalypse. All of this would be completely lost if you only saw the World of Darkness from the vampiric point of view.
They don't know I'm a warrior of Gaia.
But the great tragedy of the setting, and of the werewolves themselves, is that it's the personal failings of the Garou that cause the world to freefall towards the end times in the first place. The Garou have always been imperfect guardians. The World of Darkness isn't survival horror, it's personal horror. And every game approaches this theme from a different angle. Werewolf's Core is about those times when all of the calamitous and ruinous problems surrounding you are entirely your fault, but you're also the only one who can fix them. And unfortunately, in order to fix those problems, you just have to be a less shitty person than you currently are. While this does certainly ring true to life, there's also an element to this narrative that has always made Werewolf stand out next to the other lines in the World of Darkness. Werewolf is probably the only line that leans away from the goth punk stylings of the rest of the World of Darkness and leans into being full-on grimdark. While this does help give Werewolf the Apocalypse its own distinct personality compared to the other White Wolf games, it does have the amusing tendency to make the more personal nature of the other game lines feel just painfully self-absorbed.
And I'm just adding some drips on the corner of my mouth where it would naturally be if I was biting someone's neck.
Warriors of Gaia, do not be fooled by the beauty of the Cainite filth. Their existence is a symptom of the Great Destroyer. These are servants of the Worm.
Instead of hexing someone, use this spell to get them to leave you alone.
None of this is helpful, Warriors of Gaia. You can only rely on tooth and claw.
She was a fairy.
I can't make this any clearer. The planet is dying!
This setting was released in 1992, the second World of Darkness title, and it has for the last 3 decades been iterated upon repeatedly. In my last video, we discussed the World of Darkness in its 90s context, but we're now studying the setting through a 2021 video game, so this becomes a good opportunity to explore what's happened in all the years since the 90s. It's been 20 years since the World of Darkness was a cultural touchstone, since Vampire the Masquerade was the second best-selling TTRPG, only surpassed by Dungeons & Dragons. What the hell happened to it? There's a number of things that caused this decline. Let's start with the release of Werewolf the Apocalypse. After the hit that was Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf was released to add another supernatural POV to the setting. The next year, they released Mage the Ascension. These 3 came together to be thought of as the core trio of the World of Darkness. Vampire was a hit, Werewolf was almost as popular, and Mage, while still lagging behind the other 2, was still well-liked and widely played. But then they kept going. Wraith the Oblivion, Changeling the Dreaming, Mummy the Resurrected, and none of these were even close to the big 3. And to be clear, I would never call a single one of these games a mistake to have put out. Not even a financial mistake. Many World of Darkness fans often purchase the new core book releases more just as a book of fiction than anything else, whether or not they were intending on actually playing them. The problem was that they kept over-investing into these less popular game lines, trying to give them equivalents to all the books they were producing for their hit lines. I mentioned last time how Vampire the Masquerade spun off into a Dark Age setting, and eventually into a Victorian-era setting as well. This seemed to be a positive sign that the more popular lines were getting extra attention from White Wolf in order to pay the bills and allow the niche systems to get fun limited runs. Instead, White Wolf doubled down in a very different way, providing Dark Age books for all of their other game lines too, and then tripling down and creating more historical spin-offs for their other game lines. Werewolf the Wild West, Mage the Sorcerer's Crusade, Wraith the Great War. Vampire Dark Ages sold well. These other ones, they did not. Somehow the lasting memory of what went wrong here has gotten completely skewed. Many of the designers from that age still claim that the declining sales were because of the meta plot that accompanied these games. See, the meta plot was this detail where the World of Darkness was contemporary to the real world, and every year things would happen and the setting would advance in real time. If you wanted to keep up with how the World of Darkness was progressing alongside our own, you'd need to keep up with the new releases. Eventually, after years of this, the canon of 90s World of Darkness was so convoluted and hostile to new players that they ended up just needing to do a series of end-time events to finish the World of Darkness. And then they rebooted the canon in a series of sequels with a fresh new setting that would come to be called the Chronicles of Darkness, beginning with Vampire the Requiem in 2004. Many claim meta plot fatigue for the system's decline, and that certainly was a big factor, but I just don't personally see how that could possibly have been the biggest problem in the face of small game line overinvestment to the tune of 35 Changeling books over a 10-year period. Like I said, these niche game lines were not a mistake. I would never call them that, but they were clearly overcommitted to. Whatever the truth, all of these factors ended up combining with a general TTRPG industry decline around the year 2000. It meant that the 90s publishing strategy wasn't going to be able to carry forward into the new millennium. While White Wolf didn't appear to be in any true financial trouble yet, it was clear that it would likely happen soon. Several years earlier, TSR, the company who published D&D, had gone bankrupt and had to be bought out by Wizards of the Coast in order to stay alive. Not wanting to be the next TTRPG company to go defunct, White Wolf chose to double down on a recent strength. The video games they had been experimenting with after Vampire Redemption in 2000 had been doing quite well. And while Bloodlines in 2004 was initially a financial failure, it was still a proof of concept for just how much promise this setting had as a video game franchise. Not to mention their Hunter the Reckoning trilogy was well loved. Quite pertinent to this video, during this time period there were no less than 3 cancelled Werewolf the Apocalypse games. One by Capcom, another by Dreamforge that was quite far along actually before it lost its publisher, and another by Troika Games that was intended to be the sequel to Vampire Bloodlines. So why did the World of Darkness / Chronicles of Darkness decline? Well, the World of Darkness video games showed a ton of promise, possibly as the future of the entire IP. But a print-based pen and paper publisher like White Wolf wasn't actually in a position to support these games as they needed. If they wanted games like Bloodlines to have the resources they needed to thrive, and Werewolf to finally have the backing to get a project finished, then White Wolf was going to need to get more directly involved with video games. Rather than start from scratch, White Wolf made the fatal decision to merge with an Icelandic video game company, CCP. These are the EVE Online guys, not the China guys. Now, when you think mid-2000s video games and the phrase world of, well, then the next word you likely imagine isn't darkness, it's Warcraft. And that's where CCP's head was at too. The tabletop got sidelined and reduced to a slow trickle of content in favor of putting all the White Wolf eggs into the MMO basket. But wait, you may be saying, a World of Darkness MMO? I mean, that could actually be good. You may already be putting Josh Strife Hayes' World of Darkness review into your search bar. Well, I'm afraid the handsome British man can't help you today, because the MMO never actually released. Development stretched between 2006 to 2014, and in addition to the tabletop getting sidelined, no additional video games were actually produced at all during this time. World of Darkness was a de facto dead IP for nearly a decade. A report from The Guardian dug into the internals of why this project fell through. The biggest factor that put the World of Darkness MMO into development hell seems to have just been the fact that CCP kept on poaching White Wolf staff to work on EVE Online content. This led to repeated cycles of the project being semi-abandoned while all the programmers were gone, followed by the project being reignited and being almost entirely reimagined once the staff had been returned. They'd do a bunch of planning, get back to work, just in time for CCP to steal the programmers away yet again for more EVE Online content. There was plenty of marketing being done, but almost no serious development. By the time the project was abandoned, World of Darkness had lost its place as a major IP. Under CCP, it had gone from one of the most recognized tabletop role-playing games in the world with a burgeoning presence in the video games industry to some old game that grognards were always whining about, but I mean, hey, do you remember that old Bloodlines game? That was neat. It was a tragic fate, and deeply frustrating to fans of the series. White Wolf was purchased the following year by Paradox Interactive, a Swedish video game company who's best known for their grand strategy titles like Stellaris, Europa Universalis, and Hearts of Iron. But they also have a wide publishing net, even producing the often overlooked CRPG Tyranny. Paradox is a video game company first and foremost, but they've moved forward with the intent, at least, of not repeating CCP's mistakes. Whether they've succeeded at that is kind of a matter of debate. Work began immediately on bringing a renewed version of the tabletop back, producing a new edition of Vampire the Masquerade in 2018, and beginning to roll out a wave of small video game projects. Paradox has been very clear that they believe Bloodlines to be the crown jewel of the IP, so work began on that immediately. We are right here and now in the midst of the World of Darkness's great return. Hunter the Reckoning 5e came out in 2022, and a new Werewolf the Apocalypse edition just came out like 3 months ago at time of recording. The content mills have been releasing an ever-rolling line of low-investment small projects set in the world of darkness over the last 4 years, including a Werewolf the Apocalypse visual novel, which is actually quite good and I'd really recommend it. And finally, after 25 years of failing to produce one, they finally managed to bring a full Werewolf the Apocalypse game to completion. Now let's be clear, the fate of this new attempt at the world of darkness is still up in the air. Bloodlines 2 is the crown jewel, and whether or not Paradox's multimedia content strategy pays off kind of depends on how well it does. If Bloodlines does do well, Paradox funding shall flood into the IP and drown us in spin-offs and content with more generous budgets behind them. If it bombs though, well, if it bombs, I reckon they just sell White Wolf yet again to a new company. And if you've been watching Bloodlines 2 development, well, I'm nervous, to say the least. But here on this side of Bloodlines, we've got a werewolf game to discuss. A little project called Earthblood. But before we dive fully into that,
are you winning, Warrior of Gaia?
If you're enjoying this video, it would really help take the war to the corporations if you would like it and consider subscribing to the channel. I cover all sorts of video games that are related to tabletop franchises. Most typically this is Dungeons & Dragons, but sometimes we pop our head into Warhammer as well, and now that the floodgates have opened, World of Darkness, it's in the rotation too now. In regards to that last vampire video, just wanted to give everyone a big thank you. All your likes and comments really helped that thing get started in the algorithm, so it is now safe for this channel to regularly cover World of Darkness. You guys rule. Now, Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood begins with the most important piece of lore about the werewolf setting. So let's talk about that. The problem with World of Darkness cosmology is that it's incredibly contradictory, and it's supposed to be that way. Even different werewolf clans disagree on the werewolf creation myth. But sticking to the broad strokes, the gist of it is this. The wild, which produces raw, chaotic matter. The weaver, who spins this chaos into an ordered fabric. And the worm, who destroys to make room for the new. At some point, the weaver went mad, furious at the worm for destroying everything it would spin. It imprisoned the worm so that it could happily fill the universe with its orderly creations. The worm lost its mind in captivity, and when it broke free of its cage, it became the primeval of the entire universe, intent on destroying all until nothing remains. Gaia, our planet, needed to protect herself from the worm's destructive influence. She created the Garu and other types of shifters to be her warriors. Recognizing the potential of the primitive humans, the Garu were meant to guide humanity and to police it where needed. To allow them to do this, Gaia gifted them with the power of rage, which is a mighty boon indeed. In the World of Darkness, all but the most powerful vampires are no match for even the weakest of werewolves. But there is, as I'm sure you can already see, a downside to creating a cast of Eternal Guardians whose primary tool is anger. The werewolves' greatest downfall has always been their interpersonal problems. When humanity began inventing agriculture and settling into cities, the werewolves kind of lost their damn minds over it. Now keep in mind that the exact order of the following events that they did in response is disputed by various sources, so I'm not going to try and construct any chain of one thing leading to another. There's no definitive answers on when this stuff happened or in what order. Fearing that the city-states were servants of the Weaver, the Garu implemented a policy known as the Impergium. If they couldn't control humanity any longer, they would simply have to keep human numbers small, regularly slaughtering humans when they got too numerous. This population control policy lasted for thousands of years, leaving humanity with a sort of evolutionary trauma called the delirium. The delirium is why humans cluster together so tightly, why they fear the dark and the wilds. Indeed, the human mind can't even comprehend the Garu, and upon seeing a werewolf, the traumatized brain will simply forget what it saw if it survives the encounter. Perhaps owing to the debates surrounding the Impergium, or perhaps not, the packs grew distant from one another, distrustful of all but themselves. Eventually, this came to a head and escalated into a great war of rage that was truly the turning point where the Garou started to seriously fail at their mission of guiding humanity. The Garou believed that they were Gaia's chosen, and all the other shifters would need to serve them or be eliminated. The war reduced the shifters on all sides to a fraction of their original numbers, but the Garou ultimately came out far more numerous than any of the others. To make matters worse, no longer having the help of the other shifters, the Garou quickly turned on one another, the packs becoming cold and territorial. Every last clan was isolated and working alone against the world. Evil's grip upon humanity grew as its population boomed. The Weaver's cities rose to the skies, and the Worm's factories strangled the very air. The turning point where this turned so much worse was when an oil company named Pentex swore their devotion to the Worm and began intentionally steering the planet towards the apocalypse. The full industrial might of capitalism was behind them as they produced products that corrupted consumers and could even transform them into Fomori. The end times are coming. The machines of industry choke and drill through the wild, and the werewolves just can't stop it. Not without becoming better people than they are. This is where our game starts, after the opening cutscene. Just outside of a factory owned by Endron, a Pentex subsidiary. We are Cahal, a werewolf, and more importantly, a father. Listen, Cahal had limited options in life. I mean, look at him. It was werewolf dad, knife sharpener, or lighthouse keeper. Our pack is preparing to raid the Endron facility. But Cahal is basically the pack's heavy, which means for us, we're just supposed to stand around camp and kick dirt until something goes wrong. Which obviously doesn't sit well with Cahal, considering that the infiltrator who's going into the facility is his wife, Ludmilla. Now, breeding for werewolves is a whole thing. If they try and have children together, their werewolf blood will breathe too hot in the child, and it ends up being kind of a Habsburg situation. Instead, they need to breed with either a human or a wolf. Cahal's wife is fortunately a human. She's in fact the sister of our pack leader, but she didn't inherit the Garou powers. The mission goes south, of course it does, and Cahal rushes headlong into Endron, ripping and tearing through the security forces. Unfortunately, Ludmilla is captured by a black spiral dancer, which is a pack of werewolves that have made a pact with the Worm. Ludmilla is slain, and Cahal flies into a rage, slaying one of his packmates. Rodko, the pack leader, snaps us out of it. But Cahal's anger runs too deep, and he exiles himself from the pack and his daughter, not wanting to tear them physically or mentally apart with his rage. Now, we're not all that far into the game, but we already need to take a hard stop to discuss something that's a bit of an elephant in the room. This game's presentational quality is kind of all over the place, isn't it? The environment looks decent, and Cahal, alongside his various forms, are well-crafted models. And every other character looks like they were bought for cheap off the Unity asset store. This extends to the voice acting too. It's not just the visuals that have this roller coaster of quality.
Well, fuck you two.
This game clearly didn't have a lot to work with, and I gotta give it some compliments for the stuff that they did do well, but goddamn, is everything else just beyond bad. I reckon it's one of two things that went wrong here, possibly both at the same time even. The first is that the budget was likely not big enough to have made a game like this. Since we're here on this side of Bloodlines 2, all of the games are on the kind of low budget and therefore low risk, but also low reward school of thought. This is not the most well-liked or popular video game in the world, but I actually wouldn't be surprised if it was still a financial success. Does not look like it cost very much to make. The other thing that possibly went wrong is that I suspect there were probably some hasty rewrites. The game actually got delayed for 6 months at one point, and I have literally zero proof of this, but I feel like during that time, a lot of this game was cut out, censored, and hastily rewritten. But when it comes to the overall quality of things, the one place that completely shines is the music. Now, when you think about Werewolf the Apocalypse, I think our brains all simultaneously go to hard rock and metal. And that's exactly what we got. With some nice kind of tribal elements mixed in, it's good. Cahal spends 5 years away from his family and his pack, working as a mercenary. He takes a job stealing weapons from Endron, and soon stumbles across a note stating that the corporation's private army is about to attack the cairn where Cahal's pack resides. We return in time to save a wounded Rodko, scaring off Endron's vicious commander, Tank Girl. With Rodko out of action and many of the Garou dead, it's up to Cahal to take down the corporate facilities that have sprung up surrounding the once secluded wildlife enclave. The local spirit pleads with us to tear out the worm's influence and to restore the wild.
As Gaia weakens, so too do I.
We reconnect with our daughter, Edana, who is understandably angry that her dad abandoned her after Cahal's wife died. She's Garou too, but she prefers to take after her mother as an infiltrator, and hasn't even experienced her first change yet. Ava and her activists have taught her their ways, and Cahal is clearly terrified of this path, considering what happened to Ludmilla. As the group of us continue to infiltrate Endron territory, we learn a bit more about them. Apparently, they're running a big media campaign surrounding their new biofuel that's guaranteed 100% clean, no carbon, no nothing. Behind the scenes though, we hear what the corporation really thinks. Whether or not this biofuel is all it cracks up to be, not a single human being working for Endron gives a crap about harming the environment. In fact, many of the suits are knowingly working for the worm. So, with this explicit reference to evil companies greenwashing themselves, we've dug down and hit a rich deposit of themes. It's just a shame that Earthblood is too frightened to do anything with them. Eco-tourism is what I'm going to call the particular phrase that I absolutely cannot say on this platform. This game starts off well. I was prepared to forgive the lack of polish for the fact that this game seemed to want to sincerely give us an exploration of the concept of ecotourism. Cahal is an eco-tourist. This is explicit. They even say it straight up in much of the early advertising and interviews about this game. Now, exploring this concept is absolutely in line with the original role-playing game. It's also very respectable, I must say, how well gameplay mechanics line up with the current discussion surrounding ecotourism. Probably the most prominent book on this subject right now is this thing, which I can't say out loud because oh boy! Anyway, it asks a question that we usually don't think about very often. Where the hell are all the eco-tourists? Like, think about it. Climate catastrophe is looming on the horizon, and many of the effects are already being felt. You know, I had to cancel 5 separate medical appointments this summer because the road was on fire for 4 months! It's an issue that literally millions of people care very deeply about, and it's an issue that governments and corporations have mostly decided to not care about, outside of tiny changes and greenwashing. Peaceful protest has done very little to prompt action, and you probably know the saying about what happens when you make peaceful change impossible. Not only that, but the stakes are catastrophically high. Hundreds of millions of people stand to be put at risk if climate change isn't drastically addressed in the near future. So like I said, the question of the book is simply, where the hell are all the eco-tourists? It's kind of surprising how few there are compared to the drasticness of the cause and the foot-dragging of those in power. And by the way, there's levels of these things too. It doesn't go straight to being a werewolf and attacking corporations. There's a ton of steps along this road that are a lot closer to vandalism as a form of protest than anything like actually violent. The book cites an example that as few as 100 determined activists keying cars at night could render large cities to be completely uninhabitable to the most environmentally reckless gas-guzzling vehicles. And yet, even such a small act as that hasn't happened. The suffragettes famously smashed windows in London repeatedly as a form of protest against the government's brutality against strikers. And in the end, this diversity of tactics ended up working out great for them. Where are all the eco-tourists is the Fermi paradox of climate change. Now, let me be crystal clear about why it is we're actually talking about all this in this video. It's not because I personally have a message or an agenda I'm trying to preach right here. Honestly, I probably come down on the other side of this. I probably come down on the side that I think most forms of ecotourism, even the not interpersonally violent ones, still kind of just turns people against the cause. And look at those guys who throw tomato soup at paintings. Yes, there is a pane of glass in the way. Yes, the stuff they sprayed on Stonehenge is not permanent, it washes right off. This is like the least harmful violence anyone could do, and you look at the effect, and it's really only managed to turn people against the cause. No, the reason I've brought all this up and brought to you the best and most academic, reasonings and justifications for it, is because that this is the discussion that Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood was attempting to have. Or rather, it's a discussion that they brought up and then slowly backed away from when they realized that they were going to have to actually engage with the subject material. Look, you can find developers in interviews just outright talking about this subject.
And we're super happy to come back with the main question of Werewolf the Apocalypse, which is, when will you rage? When have you had enough? When do you just want to change into a 3-meter tall Krynos and rip the head off insert name of hate politician or terrorist leader here? I mean, in the 90s, very few people knew about sort of global warming and environmental devastation, and it was a fringe thing. And this game took a very fringe position. Today, it's something that everybody knows about, and it's very, very commonly established scientific fact. So today, I think the werewolves look at us and say, they all know, and they do nothing. And I think the fans are excited to ask the question to everybody now and just go, when will you rage, to the whole world? Because, yeah, if not now, when?
And yet, although they set all of this up, and developers in interviews stated that they wanted to explore if there was a cost to solving the climate crisis with violence, those themes never actually pay off. This game doesn't make any effort to explore these ideas. They're just set dressing, they're just kind of there. There isn't an exploration or a discussion or even very much understanding about the subject. These difficult, complex topics are brought up to impress you, like a teenager at a party dropping Nietzsche quotes. There's no debate within the game, no big choices or branching paths to weigh the pros and cons of ecotourism, no exploration of consequences or of results. My conspiracy is that someone high up got scared of if the game was going to cause a controversy, and then the team had to hastily alter damn near everything. That could be why all the NPCs look and sound like crap. They may have just been stitched in last minute to de-emphasize the ecotourism part of the story. And if that is what happened, I'm mad on behalf of the devs, because so many things are perfectly crafted to tell a story about this, and their game just got yassified in some corporate boardroom. But this game is just absolutely inexcusable compared to its peer. The Werewolf visual novel actually does explore this topic of peaceful versus violent actions against climate destruction. I'll simply say that Werewolf Heart of the Forest did it better. World of Darkness is messy, and not always well made, but it's also entirely sincere, and brave enough to talk about controversy. Werewolf could have been that. We could have had a messy game with big important ideas in it. But instead, we got a poorly made game that's utterly terrified to say anything about the ideas that it brought up. A werewolf game that manages to be utterly toothless. So, okay, if Earthblood isn't about all of the themes that it tells us it's about, what the hell is it about? Well, as we continue to attack Endron, we learn that their biofuel is known internally as Earthblood, and that Endron is somehow using it to beef up their soldiers. Not long after learning this, Cahal's worst nightmare comes true. Edana is taken by Endron CEO Richard Wadkins. Furious at letting down his niece as he did his sister, Rodko loses himself completely to his rage, forcing Cahal to put him down. We track Edana to a private prison that Endron is running, and Cahal manages to get himself locked up there. And while we're too late to save Edana, we do find the leader of a Nevada pack of werewolves there, an elder named Onawa. We learn from Onawa, and terminals spread across the rest of the facility, that Endron is experimenting on Garu, and is especially interested in Edana due to the fact that she has not yet undergone her first change. Nevada was where Endron was developing their biofuel, and where the company HQ is. So we head there with Onawa to see if we can get our daughter back and shut down the Earthblood program. Whatever the hell that is. Where the spirit of the Garu back in Cahal's cairn was all about fighting back, Onawa's clan, plus her spirit, are mostly just happy to stay put and survive, even taunting us at the very idea of fighting back. Hoping to prove ourselves to them, Cahal clears the forward base around Endron HQ, occupying it with Ava's team of activists. We rage across the office building, soon catching up to Wadkins and Adana.
You must be Kahal. It's time for you to pay for what you've done to this company. Your daughter's hate and fears will make a perfect host for Banes. And as for your friends, well, I've got a score to settle with them too. It's high time they understood. Nobody attacks Endrin. Nobody. Launch Earthblood. No! I'm gonna kill you, you motherfucker! You're gonna pay!
A red Talon, one of Onawa's pack, attacks us. Meanwhile, Wadkins demonstrates what Earthblood truly is. This Earthblood biofuel won't pollute the environment as it's burned in people's cars, but it will pollute people's souls, binding them with the evil spirits who serve the worm and transforming them into monstrous Fomori. After putting down his allies, Kahal moves to confront Onawa and the Great Spirit of her cairn. It is a genuinely fun boss fight, taking down waves of wolves and smacking down Onawa until the spirit is forced to intervene. The combat in this game is decently fun, but it's very simple, honestly feeling more like a mini-game than a core mechanic. The actual core of this game is it's very Ubisoft. First and foremost, Werewolf Earthblood is a stealth game that feels kind of like a low-effort, if vaguely competent, Ubisoft clone. Combat is usually avoidable as you can stealth clear entire rooms or just sneak past them. And even if you do intend on smashing up a room full of enemies the old-fashioned way, it's often beneficial to do some stealth work first to sabotage all the enemy reinforcement points. The stealth is reasonably well-baked, with most of Cyanide Studios' dev team coming from the latest Styx game. It means that the stealth is well-crafted, but also kind of overrepresented. Still, I can't deny that the constant swapping between wolf and human forms for stealth are a highlight. The forms, for that matter, are well implemented and specialized. Human is for computers, doors, and stealth kills. Wolf is for sneaking, moving quickly, and tight spaces. And your werewolf form is for leveling the entire city block. Still, something is notably missing here. In the tabletop version of this game, you have access to 5 forms. The 2 that are missing are the mostly human form and the mostly wolf form. Being that neither of these are actually implemented, I suspect that the version of Earthblood that we got was a result of a lot of cut corners. When you're making a creative project, you will often find that the final result of what you're making isn't immediately clear when you start the project. Projects find themselves as time goes on. Mechanics will become more obvious to the developers as the game gets more and more complete. In order to make a truly good game, you need to not only have talented people with vision, but you also need to budget enough time to make revisions. Many of the best video games of all time are the ones that have allowed themselves the space or the time to change themselves as the developers discover what they're making. Paradox, the publisher of this game, though not the developer of it, is kind of famous for doing this in a bit of a backwards way. Instead of allowing plenty of time for revisions, they constantly reinvent their games over a few years post-release. Longtime players of Stellaris will likely remember how barren and janky the first release was, followed by just this huge explosion of experimentation, discovery, and reinvention over the years until we got to the current winning formula that basically just shuts down all competing 4X space games.
Just as loud as you can. Banging on a trash can.
Most famously, this extended dev cycle is also how we got the Crusader Kings of today. The first release of Crusader Kings 2 was a classic grand strategy game with the added twist that every kingdom was a giant web of vassals that you had to deal with in order to accomplish your goals. You also didn't have to play as the ruler. You could play as those vassals and build up your domain in an attempt to seize the throne. As development continued post-launch, the devs at some point made a peculiar realization. They hadn't made a strategy game. I mean, they did, but that was actually the B plot. The incidental star of Crusader Kings 2, the great appeal of it was that Paradox had accidentally made one of the greatest medieval life sims ever. Development shifted towards adding character and story-focused content, and almost turning it into an RPG to some degree. And the game's popularity skyrocketed. And none of this would have been possible if the devs hadn't read the room of their own creation. And whatever you think of Paradox's backward strategy of discovering their games post-launch, it's certainly better than not doing it at all. Something I would argue is what made Werewolf Earthblood so bad. We see all the way back in 2019 that they had committed to the idea of this being a werewolf brawler that has extra stealth mechanics thanks to bringing on the Styx dev team.
Are brought to the fore in this game. It will be an action RPG, and it's going to be set on the North American continent.
But what probably should have been obvious to the project heads partway through the game is that what they had just designed was in fact the core components of a Werewolf the Apocalypse immersive sim. Werewolf Deus Ex, if you will. There are so many little fragments of this in the game. Moments where Cahal can use his human form to schmooze his way past guards. But it basically comes down to all problems either being solved by werewolf smashing or one very intentionally designed alternate path. Now, the fact that the game is constantly telling you to think carefully about when to wolf out, it suggests that some of the devs kind of got it, that alternate paths were supposed to be a lot more in-depth than they are. And yet, despite the fact that they had very clearly and very obviously stumbled into a cool formula for a game, the dev team just never seemed to have pivoted off of their original vision. Maybe this was inflexibility, or tight deadlines, or maybe just an unwillingness to actually fund this little project for a proper dev cycle. And so we're just left with this game that feels like an early alpha version of a much better game. When you play this game, there's just so obviously a hole there. And if you know virtually anything about Werewolf the Apocalypse, it becomes pretty obvious that that hole just happens to be shaped exactly like the Glabro and Hispro forms. A better version of this game. A version that had enough time to recommit to the gameplay loop. A version where you can use Glabro and Hispro forms to open up extra paths. I mean, that actually gets me drooling. Imagine being able to combat with a small number of enemies in your hybrid forms, and have that be your bread and butter in a fight. Then, when times get tough, you always have the option to swap to your Krynos form. But doing that will cause your foes to go absolutely feral with the delirium, fleeing and gathering allies or triggering alarms and locking down the facility, thus making everything else so much harder for you. Now, suddenly every door in the entire place is locked, so now what, Mr. Werewolf? You played yourself. This alternate version of Werewolf delivers on the core theme with so much more nuance. When is it time to get angry about climate change? The elements of the gameplay that launched do just barely reinforce these themes, just enough to ask you to ask yourself the question, but certainly not enough to meaningfully comment on it. The game we got answers the question of when to get mad by shrugging and just going, whatever you want, I guess, stealth's optional. A better version of this game that plays like Werewolf Deus Ex might lead you to many different answers to that question depending on your playstyle. The answer might be, whenever I can get away with it, or there's always another way, or right now do you not see what we're up against? This flawed version of the gameplay that we have kind of just brings up the themes. But a more complex and nuanced version of this game would have actually delivered on those ideas. A version of the game that's like that would have done a lot to make up for the fact that the story is just kind of not paying very much attention to the themes. So we've got this toothless werewolf game that's mostly about stealth mechanics. After beating the hell out of Onawa and her spirit friend, we accompany what's left of Ava's team to attack the Endron oil rig where Earthblood is produced. We find Idana. But it's too late. Endron has already completed their abhorrent experiment.
Dad, it hurts. I'm burning. No.
So we kill our own daughter. It's supposed to be the emotional climax of the game, but the devs didn't even give Adana a character model of the same console generation as Cahal. So if they don't care about this character, I mean, I guess neither do I. I'll simply say, The Last of Us did it better. There is a final choice. Chase Watkins down or rescue Ava and your allies. I choose to save Ava because, I mean, there's a million Watkins out there, but really not that many Avas. Whatever you choose, we end up in a boardroom with a Pentex executive demanding to see Watkins' research to further the purpose of the worm. It's a game where werewolves smash, except not enough to be fun, because it's mostly a stealth game. How'd this happen? How'd this get made? As stated in the first half of this video, Paradox is going broad with its multimedia policy, which honestly, I think is the correct approach. I've spoken a number of times about how Games Workshop is doing a remarkable job being so free with its license. It opens the door to allow underdog projects like Mechanicus and Vermintide to get made, all at the cost of the fact that they sometimes put out dud games. That's just the cost of being so experimental and broad-focused. Werewolf Earthblood is, in my opinion, just one of those dud games that you get every now and then with this content policy. It actually could have been really good if the budget was large enough to have made this the proper immersive sim it was meant to be. But even so, I can't waste too much time being mad about this game. There's plenty coming out in the World of Darkness right now, even on this side of Bloodlines 2, and most of it is better than this. In fact, this is probably the worst World of Darkness video game. So let's not despair just yet at the future of the IP, or even at the future of werewolf games. Who knows, we may still see Werewolf Deus Ex farther down the road. But that's Werewolf Earthblood. If any of you got interested in Werewolf the Apocalypse through this video, then check out Heart of the Forest. It's much, much better. Or check out the tabletop, it just came out.
It's time to return to Richard Dansky and see what he has to say about all the things we've just covered. Werewolf the Apocalypse is definitely one of the more focused lines in terms of its messaging. It's got very strong environmentalist messaging. Was that an important theme for the team?
Very much so, I think. When I came on board, Bill Bridges was still the line developer. Then he left to go do Fading Suns, and Ethan Skemp took over, and very much a sort of environmental, no-nonsense sensibility to it. And of course, then Ethan asked me to write Corax, and I added all the nonsense I could.
Being that the game has such a strong stance and a strong message, what sort of backlash, if any that you remember, did Werewolf or the other lines receive?
There were surprisingly few bits of backlash. The people who appreciated the viewpoints of the various games found those games, and the people who didn't just sort of passed right on by. And we were very fortunate that we did not have that sort of audience that hate watches TV, for example, that was buying the supplements just to complain about them for the most part.
Right.
People gravitated to the stuff that spoke to their mindset and were on board with it. There were always a few people who were offended on general principle. My personal favorite was the angry email I got claiming that Wraith was obviously a Christian allegory. Which was funny to me on multiple levels. First of all, the model I was using really was from Hesiod's Theogony, which obviously predates Christianity, and two, I'm not Christian, so I'm not quite sure where that came from. But
it's also quite funny to hear you say that White Wolf wasn't mired in too much controversy, because weirdly the game seems to be, or the games back then, if you look around on forums and stuff, everyone talks about it as though it was mired in controversy 24/7. So it's kind of strange to hear kind of the public perception of how controversial everything was versus how controversial it actually was.
Yeah, it really, really didn't feel tremendously controversial most of the time. I mean, okay, there were problems, or there were moments when things like YMCA's wouldn't rent out their space to vampire LARPs or things like that. But by and large, we were not constantly being barraged with hate stuff. There's a story, I don't know if it's true, that somebody called us up to ask if they could buy a bunch of books from us to burn. And supposedly what we did was unload a bunch of books that weren't selling, so everybody went away happy. But that just may be apocryphal.
When kind of the original lines ended and the CCP era began, do you know what the team was feeling about that at the time? The changeover to a new parent company, a refocus on video games. Do you know sort of what the attitude was going into that? Was it optimistic?
I do believe it was optimistic. But everybody I talked to for a long time was very enthusiastic about the product, about the idea of the MMO. Obviously, there's always frustration when you don't get to ship, but I do know that a lot of the people I talked to had good ideas and were interested in doing things right.
I understand that. Yeah, it seems like the era began with the best of intentions. Unfortunately, things obviously didn't quite go that way, and for a long amount of time, World of Darkness ended up kind of on life support for a bit there. How did that feel, either from the outside looking in, and how did it feel, I guess, to the people you were still in contact with? Was there a lot of frustration for kind of the quiet years?
I think a lot of people sort of made their peace with it and moved on. There were fond memories of the time, but the time comes to put away childish things, as it were.
Hold on to your feathers, folks, because we're traveling to the Shadowlands.
What's the matter? Don't you recognize yourself?
Wraith the Oblivion is a tabletop RPG about being dead. Well, actually, it's more like a game about being really sad about being dead. It was the fourth and least successful of the original World of Darkness games from the 1990s. The most successful, of course, being a little game called Vampire the Masquerade. Wraith was, in fact, the only one of the original 5 World of Darkness IPs to get cancelled before the intended run was finished. And yet, nearly 30 years later, in 2021, Wraith the Oblivion receives a video game, a VR horror title called Afterlife. Afterlife released in a difficult spot. Most horror and VR players didn't know very much about the IP it was based on. Meanwhile, World of Darkness fans were generally skeptical about the game, especially since the community faith has been flagging in Paradox Interactive's handling of the World of Darkness for really ages now. Thus, people seem to have just let this one pass by uninvestigated. So, with this video, we're going to bridge the gap for both audiences. We're going to talk about what Wraith is, why it failed, and also why people love it anyway. Then we're going to dive into the VR game and see if it's a good use of the source material. And I mean, spoiler alert here, I think it's exactly the game that this IP needed. And I hope that this video convinces you to take a look at Afterlife, or one of the old Wraith TTRPGs if that's your preference. Wraith is a curious little IP that not too many people are acquainted with. Games like Werewolf, Vampire, and Mage dominate the World of Darkness fandom, leaving Wraith as a bit of an afterthought. It was never a successful tabletop system. Not many groups, even in the 90s, played very much of this game. But the weird part of this is that people love Wraith anyway, even if they don't actually play it. For many people, it was their favorite part of the World of Darkness. They just didn't want to actually run it at their tables. And to some degree, this favoritism actually extends to the devs. It's clearly a passion project for them, despite being an abject failure. Even after it was cancelled, they still kept trying to bring it back in various forms. This system that couldn't even keep up when the World of Darkness was in vogue has never truly been shelved. It got a 2021 VR game, for God's sake. What's going on here? There's something to this game that captivates writers and readers. There is a reason that the TTRPG of the dead will not die. Wraith the Oblivion is a game about ghosts, and it's... I've completely lost confidence already. Fuck, how was I supposed to live up to the vampire and werewolf costumes here? Cut me a fucking break. You know, this is just fucking embarrassing.
I am my own Reaper, okay? And you know what? For most of you, that joke, it's gonna make sense in approximately 10 to 15 more minutes. The world of darkness has always been heavy on themes. Vampire is about outcasts. Werewolf is about everything being your fault. And Mage, well, Mage is about ambition. Wraith, however, is a game about it being too late for you. You're already dead, and there's nothing you can do but regret it. And this is part of the reason why people don't usually like to play Wraith all that much. There are many upsides to being an outcast in Vampire, and Werewolf, there's a lot of family and honor involved in learning to change and be a better person. And I mean, Mage, as I said, it's about ambition. There's no shortage of upsides to that. There is, however, no upside whatsoever to being dead and regretting your life. Your character already had all of your chances to have a fantasy life, but they wasted it. This lack of playability, believe it or not, actually predates the game considerably. Wraith the Oblivion is actually not the fourth World of Darkness game. It's actually the first. In the back of Wraith Revised Edition, creator Mark Reinhagen tells it that Wraith began long before Vampire the Masquerade. It was originally a game titled Inferno, about being a sinner trapped in hell, and the players were mostly humoring old Mark as he tormented their characters. Based on the sounds of things, some strange events occurred during the playtests, leading the group to conclude that the game was cursed. They might have just been saying that so they didn't have to tell Reinhagen that they didn't like the game, who knows. If you want the full story of the Inferno curse and why some people think it passed on to Wraith, I actually strong-armed my friend Jacob Crow to cover it on his channel as a Halloween episode last year. So I'm gonna drop a link down below and you can go check it out. For us, the important part of the story is this: no one enjoyed playing a game about suffering while dead. And despite all the changes when Inferno eventually became Wraith, that legacy carried on. The reception at release was remarkable, honestly. The writers wrote the hell out of this thing, and this setting is, in many ways, it's as close to art as tabletop RPGs have ever gotten. Fans loved reading about it, but there were huge problems playing it. The fantasy being unappealing for a role-playing game was only one part of the problem. It encouraged that guy behavior through the shadow system. Its themes could be spread thin, and also its lore had a very big identity problem that made it quite difficult to know what kind of thing they were actually going for. The writing was clearly good, but playability was an issue. Rather than fixing it, White Wolf kind of doubled down in a very weird direction, ultimately choosing to make the game even darker and largely less appealing to play. Some of you at home right now are saying, hey, I want to play a really dark game. No, you don't. Let me tell you how dark this thing got, because this all culminated in a book called Charnel Houses of Horror, where you're all playing ghosts who died in the Holocaust. This was a very strange book. Although there were no shortage of reviewers at the time who denounced it on site, having, basically the most offensive premise one could imagine, many more were forced to admit that the book was written with tremendous respect for the topic, and written with the advice and review of horror writer and child of Holocaust survivors Janet Berliner. The idea is not to trivialize the Holocaust, they wrote, to reduce it to the level of just a game. Rather, the concept behind this book is to use the medium of role-playing as another way to tell the story of the Shoah, the story that must constantly be retold. Despite a fair amount of begrudged respect for what they had accomplished with Charnel Houses, pretty much everyone, even the people who really enjoyed what they were going for, were pretty much unanimous in their agreement that this thing was worthless as a tabletop game. In creating this book, White Wolf, or rather their more adult publishing wing, Black Dog, stumbled across something that may not seem obvious. There's actually a hard limit to how dark you can make your themes in a tabletop role-playing game. Because really at the end of the day, you're trying to have a good time with your friends. And while the debate certainly rages on as to where exactly the line is as to which topics are too heavy for the medium, there are few who would disagree that Charnel Houses is more or less unusable as a role-playing game due to being far past wherever the line is. Even if it may still be valuable as a work of fiction, or even as a work of art.
And to some degree, this phenomenon with charnel houses was actually also true of Wraith in general. Even though a lot fewer people are going to take any kind of offense to the base game of Wraith the Oblivion when compared to charnel houses, we still run into the problem that most people don't want to hang out with their friends and pretend to be sad ghosts who regret their life. The result was that Wraith was cancelled in 1999, 4 years before the various End Times events ended all of the other World of Darkness metaplots. Wraith was mercifully given the End of Empire book to finish its own plotline, and tie it into the End Times events of the other systems. The devs didn't necessarily have to do that, but they clearly loved Wraith and didn't want to abandon it without a proper send-off. In fact, they came back with a short reimagining of Wraith in 2003 with Orpheus. This version was a limited run that was always intended to be wrapped up in 6 sourcebooks. See, White Wolf by now was starting to learn their lesson about spin-off overinvestment. Orpheus differs from Wraith in that it is centered around a corporation named Orpheus that is attempting to profit off the world of the dead. You play as Wraiths employed by the corporation, or as living workers who astral project into the Shadowlands as their 9 to 5. There have been more attempts to spin off of Wraith over the years, such as Geist Sin Eater, but none have ever really managed to capture the audience in the same way as the original. Ultimately, the sad legacy of Wraith is that it's an amazing work of fiction, but not a very good tabletop role-playing game. But that's actually okay, because Wraith could easily make a comeback as a series of novels, an internet miniseries, or even video games. Yes, that's right. Let's not lose sight of the fact that this video is supposed to be about the Wraith Afterlife VR game. I think I've already made the case that Wraith might be better in other mediums than it is in its original form. So that makes Afterlife a very exciting prospect indeed. Frankly, whether or not Wraith ever receives a 5th edition of the tabletop system in the modern day, I wouldn't really look to it if you want to see Wraith in all its glory. Spin-offs are where it may finally have the chance to thrive. Now, all of this has actually been quite vague so far. People liked Wraith a lot, and all I've really talked about thus far is why it doesn't work as a tabletop RPG. What makes Wraith so good? And why is it everyone's favorite system that they don't play? Wraith the Oblivion begins at the moment of death, and the world expands from there. So, let's suppose, my dear viewer, that you are the subject of today's Wraith story. You have died. Picture it just now. Is this a good time to die? Do you have things you still need to do, things left unsaid? Did you leave things poorly with any of your loved ones? Well, too bad. You're dead. And that's not fair. But we really don't get to choose these things, do we? Now, for what it's worth, most souls do not become Wraiths, but you have. You are now bound to the Shadowlands, a mirror version of our own world where the forces of entropy reign supreme. You will see the trees as dead, you'll see your car as a rusted heap of scrap, and to you, the skyscrapers on the horizon will seem as crumbling husks. You will be confused when you first arrive in the Shadowlands. Nothing will look right. Likely, you don't even realize you're dead yet, as you replay your final moments over and over. This is because Wraiths are born into unlife with a protective cocoon of plasm called a caul. Maybe a cowl? I'm pronouncing it caul. If someone doesn't take it off of you, your confusion may fossilize and prevent you from becoming a Wraith. Instead, you'll become a drone, a confused spirit reenacting its life over and over. Fortunately for you, a hand pulls the plasmic caul off of you. The Wraith that did this for you is called your Reaper. Ghostly tradition sees it that the two of you are now obligated to one another. The Reaper is obligated to teach you and mentor you to survive your early time in the Shadowlands. Likewise, you owe them, and you're expected to assist them for a time. The agreement is informal. Your Reaper may simply ask a favor in return, or they might treat you like a squire or apprentice, or they might even just take you as a slave. We're gonna touch on that angle later, but for now, let's assume this. Congratulations, you're one of the lucky ones. Your Reaper is kindly and will show you the ropes and won't take too much from you in return. Your Reaper begins to explain the nature of your new existence. Your body isn't what it used to be. It's no longer flesh, it's corpus. An approximation of what you think you looked like, molded from plasm. In time you might learn to change it, but most never do. So I hope you visualize yourself in your favorite jacket, because you're not getting changed anytime soon. Your Reaper tells you that your stay in the Shadowlands is more of a privilege than a right. You're not naturally here like a human bound to Earth by gravity. No, you've been tethered to this place by your fetters, which are objects, people, or places that were important to you in life. If your loved ones die, if your mementos are destroyed, and your treasured places desecrated, no more Shadowlands for you. And no, that doesn't mean you get to move on to the next life. No, if you can't stay in the Shadowlands, you go somewhere so much worse. A roiling vortex of nightmares that your Reaper calls the Tempest. And now that you mention a next life, the hereafter, nobody has any clue if it's actually real. Transcendence to the hereafter is possible, and some Wraiths do succeed at moving on to something else if they can come to be at peace. But it's actually so rare that most Wraiths view it as a fairy tale. Your own Reaper is coherent enough to tell you that it might be real, it might not. So to most Wraiths, most probably including you, accepting your fate feels like a waste of time and effort compared to just about everything else you're gonna have to deal with in the Shadowlands. The other way out of these dark realms is going to consume a lot more of your attention: Oblivion. Oblivion is the howling void spilling out into the Tempest from a dark labyrinth at the very bedrock of reality. It will haunt you always, it will hound you, and in all likelihood it will win. Because when you died, you did not do it alone. In each of us there are dark urges, impulsive thoughts, self-destructive tendencies. These slabs of meat we inhabit are able to inhibit the worst of our dark sides. Our body more or less forces us to work together to keep our protein mech alive and in one piece. But your body is gone, and your corpus hasn't got the same instincts. Your shadow, the dark and self-destructive half of your heart, is free. It will pursue you, torment you, and trick you until you both have been dragged screaming into oblivion. When you inevitably fall, Oblivion will not consume you completely, because it still needs you for now. It will put your shadow in command of your void-soaked corpus, and you shall be a Wraith no longer. You will be a specter. Worse, your shadow is capable of allying with monstrous specters to try to break you. This is called a harrowing, a time when you are assaulted by the forces of Oblivion from both within and without. You will likely lose touch with reality before losing touch with your own soul. In-game, a second player is chosen to actually control your shadow, and it's their job to ensure that your Wraith is never free of the angst that dominates your unlife. Because that's just how it's going to be, your Reaper explains to you. You will watch your loved ones grow old, you will watch your fetters decay or be destroyed, and when that happens, you will fall into the Tempest and the slavering hordes of specters that live inside until every bright patch of your soul has crumbled away. With so few Wraiths believing in transcendence, it would seem to most as though Oblivion is inevitable. Wraith is a bleak and a hopeless setting, but you're not without strengths of your own. For starters, this corpus of yours is extremely durable. It regenerates quickly and easily in the presence of your fetters. You will have affinities for certain arcanoi, the ghostly magics of varying schools that you can learn and use to navigate the afterlife. You also may have relics. These are rare, and they're not going to last you your whole eternity, but they will help you in the short term. Relics are objects that were destroyed alongside you or were buried with you. They will help you in unique ways and may even have special powers. Lastly, you have your Reaper. since you were fortunate enough to find a kind one, and perhaps in time you'll do some reaping of your own to find followers who could help you. I mentioned that Wraiths have a code binding Reaper to newborn Wraith, but why? What does that mean, and who made this code? Well, that's a secret that your Reaper has been kind enough to keep from you for now. Wraiths have a code, but also a society. Your Reaper's reluctant to tell you much more than that, but you're taken to a haunt to serve as your new home. A haunt is a place of tragedy and death in the mortal world. This makes it remarkably habitable to Wraiths. You will feel much more human when you're there, and will be able to tangibly affect the world to a greater degree than usual. But it's also the place where you're safest from specters and maelstroms from the Tempest. Haunts vary in size, from a vast derelict hospital to a burned-out car abandoned in a ditch. Most likely, though, you're not alone here. Other Wraiths will make this place home, and it's difficult to trust them because they might end up getting jittery and sell you into slavery before you can do it to them. Keep your distance though, and things will most likely stay cordial. But maybe, just maybe, you're able to build a decent partnership with a few other Wraiths here. Maybe you are all reaped by the same guy, or you come together to deal with a problematic ghostly roommate in the haunt. You have now crossed the threshold from an independent Wraith to becoming a part of the basic unit of Wraith society. The group of you are now a circle, and with luck, this is going to be as far as you interact with the greater shadow world. In a game of Wraith the Oblivion, you are a member of a circle. It's taken a lot of luck just to make it this far. Someone had to remove your call. They needed to not be a bastard, and the haunt they sent you to had to be safe, and then you needed to have not fallen to your shadow or get run off by those who have. You have all you need in this state of things to play Wraith the Oblivion. You have a good grasp on what Wraiths are, a basic understanding of their living situation, and the basic threats they face each day. Maybe you've even found a handful of Wraiths who will pay you for solving problems, with strange deathly coins. Much of the gameplay will be very personal. Maybe you'll have to protect the loved ones who are your fetters and become something of a guardian angel. Or you might need to stop acting like an angry poltergeist and learn to let your spouse move on. You might develop Arcanoid to try and get back your beloved photo collection before those ungrateful children of yours can dispose of them. Or ask a circle for help when your widow calls an exorcist because your ghostly presence is kind of freaking everyone out. Which is definitely not your fault, because honestly, you'll be damned before you let death stop you from being there for family TV night. Honestly, who cares if you're giving everyone a chill and knocking paintings off the walls? You know what? Death will not stop you from keeping up on weekly episodes of Shogun. These stakes are actually not as low as they sound. You pretty much have to maintain contact with your old life. There's no other way to protect your fetters. Abandoning them will doubtlessly end up in them being destroyed at some point, sending you reeling into the Tempest. Much of Wraith the Oblivion is reactive. Work with your circle to cling to the fragments of your life, defending your fetters from threats both living and dead, while also ensuring that malevolent spirits stay the hell away from your haunt. But there's still a problem. Is this it? Is this the fate of a Wraith? Will they never amount to more than forming gangs hiding out in haunted houses? Well, no. There's far more. When Wraith gets summarized, it's this half of the setting. The very personal side of undeath. But the problem is that there's kind of not a lot to do. The developers might have decided to flesh this out so that you always felt like there were clear objectives of personal horror. Instead, the writing went a very different direction. While the core themes of Wraith are very personal, the lore is much more expansive. Maybe on your journeys you've been warned about the ferrymen, strange, distorted wraiths paddling their rafts across the stable routes of the Tempest. You must never interfere with their duty, for they are dangerous to the extreme. Yet, so too are they needed to allow wraiths some ability to travel the Tempest, even if it's still with great risk. If you can pay the ferrymen, they might even allow you to come with them. These ferrymen are the key to the wider world of Wraith, the connection point between the huddled lonely Wraiths and the vast, dark kingdoms of the unliving. Your Reaper wasn't honest with you, and that was a kindness, because what they called the traditions and custom of Wraiths, those were in fact laws. You are living in a ghostly state, the dark kingdom of iron, based in the ancient city of Stygia. It was founded by Charon, the first ferryman who proclaimed himself the Emperor of the Dead. The long shadow of Stygia hangs over all the lands of the unliving. Charon has been missing for decades now, but his foul and tyrannical empire has ground ever onwards, drowning the afterlife in tyranny. The influence of Stygia touches all. The haunt you live in may merely be a small corner of a necropolis, an inverted city housing the dead, and governing the local wraiths on behalf of the Stygian hierarchy. But how could you not have seen this? How could you not have known? The signs were all right there, right from the moment your call was pulled off of you. You were told you were lucky that you weren't taken as slave, but why would wraiths need slaves? What work is there even that needs doing? Who would they have sold you to? And whose face was printed on the strange death coins you were paid earlier? The city of Stygia stands atop a lofty isle in the Tempest, and though the ferrymen keep the paths clear that all roads shall lead to Stygia, you must never go there. A wraith who sits in a haunt and weeps that his loved ones have moved on without them is about the most privileged and coddled unlife a wraith can have. Many, perhaps most, Reapers work for Stygia. Tens of thousands of wraiths have their call removed only to find themselves dragged in chains into the Stygian mines. Oh yes, this place has mines. To make a kingdom of the dead, there has always been one problem: a lack of material. The dead cannot touch, cannot take things with them. For so long, all that these dark kingdoms had were relics, but those will fade and decay with time. But in Stygia, it was discovered that the blackened substrate at the darkest depths of the labyrinth, the place just before dark Oblivion, could be mined. The dark legions of Stygia descend the stairs, going ever downward, lazily providing a half-hearted defense of their charges as they are assaulted and harrowed by the powerful specters. The substrate these slaves pull from the walls is hauled back to the city, where great spires are built for the vanity of Charon's council. And when these slaves break, their minds shattered and bordering on falling to their shadow, the Legion drags them back to Stygia. Not for their safety, not so that they can recover, of course not. They are taken to the Soul Forge. Powerful wraiths with horrific arcanoi hammer these wretches into basal soul metal. This is the fate of most wraiths down here. Not oblivion, but endless toil, and eventually being reduced to slag, and being used to forge the Legion's weapons and armor and industries. And in a way, you're complicit, aren't you? What did you think those coins were made of? Didn't you wonder why they weep? So maybe now you can comprehend why you're so lucky to stew in your misery, in your safe, secluded little haunt. Because the Empire of Stygia is undergoing a foul industrial revolution, and to them, you're little more than a hunk of iron pulled from rancid soil. If you're smart, you'll stay hidden. But if you're the player of a TTRPG, I'm certain you'll have questions and feel a need to seek out answers. And if you dig deep, they are there to be found. The afterlife wasn't supposed to be like this. The Tempest didn't always rage, and Stygia didn't always loom over the dead. This all happened because Charon the Ferryman failed. But he didn't just fail, he failed you. Before Charon was a ferryman, he was nothing but a simple wraith, and before that, he was a Mycenaean. Mycenaeans being one of those pre-Bronze Age collapse peoples, they were basically Greeks who did not yet know how to Greek very good. The Mycenaean era was considered to be the great age of heroes for Proto-Greece, and Charon's story was likely wrapped up in such deeds. Such that when he died and passed into the Shadowlands, he was greeted by Lady Fate herself, who had taken a liking to him. She granted him power, but also a duty. He was to be a ferryman. He was to be the great guide of the dead in this dark underworld. There was much work to be done. Charon became the first to sail the placid black waters of the Sunless Sea. It was there that he found an island to serve as his headquarters, a place that would come to be called Stygia. The first ferryman gathered the worthiest wraiths to become fellow ferrymen, and then their whole order got to work on Lady Fate's mission. Most of the ferrymen devoted themselves to finding lost wraiths in the Shadowlands and guiding them safely to the Isle of Stygia. Other ferrymen got to the work on the other half of Charon's quest, namely, figuring out what the hell was on the other side of the Sunless Sea. You see, Stygia was simply a place to gather the dead. It wasn't where Charon was supposed to be sending them. Charon departed at some point at the behest of Lady Fate, descending down into the labyrinth that encased Oblivion. When he returned, he did so with a great wraithsmith, and the two of them began turning Stygia into a proper city in the stylings of Athens and Rome. Material was short, but the smith was talented, and they drew stones from fallen civilizations and temples. Charon called the ferryman home. He had reached the far side of the labyrinth while he was down there. He had looked at the foul void of Oblivion itself, and he had a revelation. It was growing. Every soul that the ferryman failed to guide would feed the horrid mass and allow it to grow larger. Monsters had been seen of late. The first specters, who the ferryman had failed. Charon declared that they would need to do better. Every lost soul meant that this place came one step farther to being swallowed by the hungry mass at the abyss of reality. Fortunately, the explorers returned from across the sea, calling themselves the Shining Ones. They spoke of distant far shores. Every one of the islands there was a different afterlife belonging to one of the mortal religions. There were hells and heavens and Valhallas abound, waiting to be filled with wraiths. While it was certainly fascinating that religious belief seemed to create these places, and thus every religion became more or less true, it was clear to Charon and the ferrymen that these were mainly a sort of therapy to soothe wraiths until they could transcend to the hereafter. An arrangement was set up. The ferrymen would guide the dead to Stygia, where Charon would protect them, and then the Shining Ones would send barges to retrieve these wraiths and bring them to whichever far shore Charon deemed best for them. Charon knew that the world was too fragile for him to not take this seriously. A bureaucracy was needed to see the work done. Charon began to notice the success of the new Roman Republic in the mortal world, and began styling Stygia based off of it. From this moment onward, Charon became convinced that his ghostly nation was best ruled by adopting the ideas of mortals. Too many wraiths had slipped from his grasp and fallen to the great enemy. When the armies of Rome began to conquer the Mediterranean, Charon proclaimed that they must be a dark parallel to the burgeoning empire. Builders set to work constructing otherworldly roads across the Dark Plain, stretching all across the European and Middle Eastern Shadowlands. The ferrymen contacted the living, as this was not yet taboo, and requested that the dead be buried with coins on their eyes to pay a death tax to Charon. These coins would pass on as relics that Stygia could take and forge into weapons for their new legion. If the dead didn't have these coins, wraiths were expected to trade their own hands or eyes instead. Where the armies of Rome marched, Stygia followed behind, gathering up the wraiths left in the slaughter, and setting up ghostly outposts and roads. The Tempest did not exist in this time. The The Sunless Sea was nothing but calm and dark as Charon's empire began to give it form. But all was not well in the ghostly nation. Their mirroring of Rome didn't sit well with the ferrymen. Their duty was to be guides of the dead, not to help Charon become a deathly prince. Worse, the Roman stylings of Stygia meant that the enemies of the sprawling empire of the living would instinctively rebel against its shadow in death. Soon there were tribes of ghostly Gauls, plasmic brigands, and undead Christian martyrs abound, throwing the whole order into chaos. It all came to a head when the Roman Empire fell, and the city itself was sacked. Charon's great experiment, building Stygia as a mirror kingdom, had been a disaster. Untold numbers of wraiths slipped through the cracks at an accelerated pace, and soon the first great maelstrom ripped across the afterlife. Stygia was shattered by rampaging specters, until little more remained of the Dark Empire than an ailing capital and endless roads through the void. The surviving ferryman crawled out from the wreckage and told Charon that, you know what, they played a pretty good game, but the other team just wanted it more. But at the very least, I guess we've all learned that LARPing as human empires and tying ourselves down with mortal politics is a bad idea. Well, thank the Lady Fate that we discovered this lesson early on into our history, and we can go back to normal now, yeah? And Charon said, no, I know what the real problem was. Stygia had stayed a republic, even when Rome had thrown out their senate and become a dictatorship. Democracy. That was clearly the problem here. When Charon put a dark crown atop his head and declared himself Caesar Eternal of the Dead, the ferrymen denounced him. This was not their duty. Their duty was to guide, never to rule. Charon, the first ferryman, cast his own order out from Stygia, never to be allowed to return. For their part, the ferrymen went back to work. They still brought the newly dead to Stygia, even if they no longer entered it themselves. They suspected Charon's fall to tyranny was the work of his shadow. If even the chosen of fate could succumb like this, maybe it was best for the ferrymen to find a way to solve this once and for all. They cracked a deal with Anubis, who might actually just have been a Garu werewolf who got trapped in the afterlife. World of Darkness is weird. And he taught them a ritual to split their shadows off of themselves. The shadows could not be destroyed, but they could be separated. Every ferryman, save the stubborn tyrant Charon, went through this ritual. It was a trade-off. Their shadows were now loose, independent, and malicious creatures, but at least the ferrymen were now of clear mind and judgment. The Sunless Sea had become a tempest during the Maelstrom, but it had calmed somewhat since then. For the rest of time, the pattern would emerge. Great periods of traumatic mortal death, followed by vast maelstroms breaking free of the labyrinth. And when they would recede, the Sunless Sea would be left a little more turbulent than before. Charon decreed the Code of the Dead. Wraiths must not interfere with the living as they had done in the past. He decreed that Stygia had rightful ownership of all the newly dead, and that any Reaper who removes an infant Wraith's call had a duty to keep them safe, but they were entitled to extract payments from their charges if they wished, just as the ferrymen had. Every Wraith, Charon concluded, could now essentially be a ferryman and guide souls to his city. This did not work well at all, and Stygian attempts to keep up with the arrivals of the newly dead failed en masse. But despite Charon's failure to protect the wider afterlife, Charon's autocratic rule did end up stabilizing Stygia. As the maelstroms of the Crusades and the Black Death ripped the underworld apart, Stygia held strong. Charon's knights fighting to keep the specters at bay. The Sunless Sea had begun to transform into the Howling Tempest, but the stable roads carved out in Roman times held fast. But soon, something else would happen that would change the dynamic once more. Charon's spies and emissaries returned from surveilling the far shores. The Shining Ones had grown corrupt and overcome by their shadows. The great barges carrying the dead from Stygia wouldn't go to paradise or to perdition as planned. They would simply be herded into vaults and buried for all time, while the Shining Ones above lived as gods and warred upon one another. Furious that the Shining Ones had failed in their mission to allow the dead a chance to transcend, Kharon declared that the dead would no longer cross the Shining Sea. He ordered that the entire concept of transcendence was now heresy. He would gather every wraith across the breadth of the afterlife and drag them to his city. Here, they would be his eternal servants. Here, he could keep them safe from oblivion. The colonial era had begun in the mortal world, and Stygia took part, establishing colonies in every major city in the Western world that would come to be called necropoli. He made devastating war against the other Dark Kingdoms, seeking to finally rule all mortal dead as he proclaimed long ago. Many wars were fought against the African, Asian, and Mesoamerican lands of the dead. The final piece of the awful puzzle of what Stygia would become began with the Triangle Trade. As Stygia was flooded with the dead he had captured, Kharon began trying to put them to work en masse, taking them as slaves. Many were thrown into a moat surrounding the city, forced for all eternity to serve as a demented psychic barrier from the howling tempest beyond Stygia's harbor. The rest were sent, accompanied by the legions, down into the labyrinth, to carve stone from the very depths of reality itself. Despite what Kharon told himself, his legion barely lifted a finger to stop the specters down there from carrying slaves in their millions off into oblivion. And even those unfortunates who managed to survive the toil down there were not free. When they were no longer useful, the thralls would be dragged to the dark foundries of Stygia, and their souls hammered into weapons, coins, or industrial goods. The actions of Kharon did nothing but accelerate the suffering of those he was meant to protect, and accelerate the expansion of Oblivion. But Kharon, near mad with power, had his detractors mulched and forged into accursed railroads, battleships, and bomber craft. When World War I raged, Stygia was unharmed, a foul industrial fortress that kept the specters away with weapons the underworld could no longer comprehend. As millions died in the trenches, the shell-shocked wraiths born from the devastation were loaded into ghostly trains and carted off to the mines to toil away the eternities. The Sunless Sea was now little more than a small region of the roiling tempest, the Stygian roads now offering no more shelter than a shaded avenue in a hurricane. Specters were everywhere, hounding the Shadowlands and the newly dead even on the calmest of days. Oblivion was nearing victory. And then came World War II. Now, we may remember that the ferrymen, way back after the Roman Empire fell, had divested themselves of their shadows, but Kharon did not. Now, it's unclear exactly when he had this realization, but I presume it was probably after Kharon sent a fleet of ironclad battleships built from the screaming souls of those he was supposed to protect, and start carting away all those sweet souls killed in the Pacific Theater to go to his mines. Well, I presume that's the moment when Kharon finally realized that his shadow actually might have been a bad influence on him. Kharon finally, 2,000 years late to the party, does a ritual to separate himself from his shadow. It goes skittering off somewhere into the tempest. And don't worry, it won't be a problem going forward. The first ferryman looks about at his nightmare machine he had built when he was supposed to be guiding the dead, and he says, well, I think we can all agree that the last 2,000 years have been, let's say, regrettable. But the good thing is, now we can finally start working towards healing and getting back to... Sorry, what's that? America is attempting to do what with the atom? The deaths caused by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki tore a hole through the labyrinth itself and allowed a creature from before time to pull itself up. This colossal never-born creature was fused with Kharon's own shadow to form the true stuff of nightmares. Ghost Godzilla. It was Ghost Godzilla. I'm actually not joking. And this great spectral kaiju began wading through the ocean to begin a rampage in Stygia itself. Now, I wish I could tell you that Charon did one last bastard thing and forced the Soul Forges to build him a giant ghost robot, but that is not what happened. Instead, Charon finally took responsibility for all the crap he's put the world through, and he fights the creature in the Bay of Sorrows, armed with nothing but his scythe. It was a colossal battle that only ended when a whirlpool consumed both combatants. Charon has not been seen since, and Stygia has limped on since that day. Still being incredibly foul and evil, Charon never ended up getting the chance to fix it. There is so much more lore to this setting. Heretic factions, the fact that the Asian Emperor of the Dead is maybe the chaddest character in the entire world of darkness, or the existence of a faction that dives into the labyrinth to fight specters, and they call themselves the Doom Slayers. Or better, this goes deeper than that because there's a sub-faction of the Doom Slayers called, I shit you not, the Hell Divers. But I am probably overstaying my mandate a little if I go too much farther. I bothered to outline a lot more lore than I usually do, and all of this is so that you can properly understand what Wraith the Oblivion is. For games like Vampire and Werewolf, it's pretty easy to figure it out at a glance. But upon hearing about the sad ghost game, you may not realize how fucking bonkers it is. And all of this extended giant world, it's a big part of why people love Wraiths so much. Unfortunately, all of this cool backstory very much undercuts the core themes of Wraith. Wraith is a game of personal horror, a game where you're a sad ghost trying to accept your own death. But it's also a game where Charon the ferryman of Greek mythology becomes Roman emperor and then 1v1s a giant nuclear ghost kaiju. These things are pretty obviously at odds with one another, and it's very much to the detriment of your ability to actually play the game comprehensively. The system can't really decide if it's a down-to-earth story that lives up to its intended themes, or if it's a dark fantasy game where you're a ghostly D&D party exploring the afterlife in search of treasure and riches under the nose of Stygia. And unfortunately, the writers never ended up solving that problem. They would write so much about how Wraith was this supposed game about personal horror, but very little support was given to that side of things in favor of doing even more wacky world building. Like, sure, it's great that we know about an undead Polar Express that travels the Tempest, but to this day, most people, myself included, are still not really sure what you're supposed to be doing all day in your haunt, or how to have grounded adventures in the Shadowlands. Wraith isn't a game, it's two. And while both parts are individually cool as hell, neither one was ever fully baked. It's possible to merge these two things if you have a very advanced group capable of keeping touch with their Wraiths' personal lives while they're off having goth punk D&D adventures in the land of the dead. But ultimately, it's very hard to keep the tone straight when you're a sad ghost crying that your loved ones are moving on without you, and then some guy bursts in, offers you a Stygian forged Desert Eagle, and says, "Hey kid, ready to join the Hell Divers?" Matter of fact, I've been chatting a bit on this topic with Auntie Haunty, and we're planning on doing an experimental Wraith game with her actual playgroup, the Handful of Nerds. If you're interested, hike out to the Handful of Nerds channel and subscribe. It's a good gang of people, and I reckon you'll love the Fallout actual play they've been airing so far. Anyway, Wraith as a tabletop game has a lot of problems. First and foremost is that it's so grim that most people won't even think it sounds fun, so it has a hard time actually getting players. Number 2, the lore is more like two unrelated games that have very little to do with one another, but there are other problems too. Being that the game is so focused on the personal, it can be hard for all the members of the group to actually get enough time to explore their own stories in a way that is satisfying. you probably don't want to be playing Wraith with a big group of people. The shadow system can also be a problem too. Every single player is given carte blanche to fuck with another player during gameplay. If any of your players are even 10% of a that guy, then the shadow system is going to bring out the worst in them and destroy your whole friend group. This game is playable to an advanced group who's been playing together for years and have a good dynamic and a solid vision for the game. But to any group that doesn't fit that description, Wraith is an unplayable masterpiece. Honestly, while Wraith is clearly very special as a setting, it may just not be a good fit for a tabletop RPG. And that's okay. There's always the potential to try again in different mediums, such as today's topic, a video game. Wraith Afterlife is a VR horror game released in 2021 by Fast Travel Games, who have since created Vampire Justice, a VR masquerade game set in Venice. Inevitably, any attempt to adapt Wraith is going to need to decide which of the two vibes it's going to follow. Is this personal horror, or is this goth punk D&D? Afterlife chose the former, and as such, it is a true horror title set in a single haunted mansion in the Shadowlands. I think there's room in the story for a sequel that starts exploring the larger lore, but we can discuss that later. I'm a big fan of horror in most formats, novels, TV, video games, but for me the line has always been VR. That's just too far for me, man. I like horror, but I just don't like feeling unsafe while I'm playing a game. Listen, if you're not a VR player, you may not know how much worse this stuff is. You ever get scared and imagine that there's something right behind you? Well, in VR, there really is something behind you. See, this is a clip of me desperately trying to close the game and remove my headset. Wraith Afterlife properly fucked me up. You will doubtlessly see a number of reviews around the internet claiming that this game is boring and not scary. Well, the thing is that Afterlife is a bit of a slow burn, and the first hour or two doesn't have all that many spooks. Most reviewers who make it to the part of the game where specters start showing up will rather quickly change their tune. Wraith is, by most accounts, one of the scarier VR titles out there. Horror is obviously subjective, so I'm certain there will be a number of commenters saying, "Hey, it couldn't be me, I ain't afraid of no ghosts." Well, I'm happy for you, but for me, I would have sessions where I would actually be trembling for 10 minutes after I took the headset off. But we've gotten ahead of things. The protagonist of Wraith Afterlife is Ed. And the thing about Ed is he's We awaken on a cliff road. You may notice immediately that this game omits the Call and Reapers. It's actually not a lore break, even if it feels like one. It will make more sense later. A number of memories and drones tell us as we follow the path that we are Ed, a photographer whose photos are special, able to capture things that Ed isn't fully aware of. For our part, it seems that in life, Ed was just here to capture the LA nightlife. It's implied that Ed had come to the City of Angels in hopes of making it big as a celebrity photographer. At the end of the road is a massive mansion that we arrive at with Ed's wife, Rachel. Inside we see the drones of a few key figures. Alan Vincent is an old movie star. Tom Shepard is a gallery curator that Ed has history with, and then there is Meadow, a psychic medium here to hold a seance for the owner of the mansion. The ailing billionaire banker turned movie producer, Howard Barclay. Rachel and Ed are here as Barclay wants us to photograph the seance and capture any ghostly phenomenon. We soon stumble across some of Ed's photos hanging on the walls in the foyer. As a Wraith, it's much easier to see what Ed couldn't in life. Dude's photos were haunted as all hell. A sinister voice in our head directs us to come find him, and introduces us to the main navigational tool in the game. Our arm works as a dowsing rod, and It's actually a bit clumsy, to be honest. It's very easy to get stuck in this game and not know what to do next. Anyway, on our way to find the voice in our head, we pretty quickly find out that Meadow is pocketing everything from the billionaire's house that she can. We stumble across the image of a woman, Cassandra, from long before our seance. A starlet from one of Barclay's movies. She's thrilled to be invited to what seems to be a celebrity party. A little farther up, we find a younger Alan Vincent discussing their intentions with this bright-eyed woman. They take the discussion to Barclay's office, so we have to go key hunting for a way in. We stumble across our first Spectre, the least threatening of the bunch. Fortunately, the restless thing isn't paying attention to us for now. We find the key and shuffle past this thing, which doesn't seem that scary on playback, but it's not a good time in VR, I promise. This little segment concludes with us needing to input a security code into a safe, while this thing is like a foot behind us, just trying to grab us. It's so uncomfortable. Wraith really knows the horror of proximity in VR, and of having something scary being behind you. The security code opens a door to a staircase leading elsewhere in the mansion. This becomes the very first hint of what will become clear as the game progresses, namely the fact that Barclay's mansion is a really well-designed location, in that school of old-school Capcom horror titles. It's not that big as a location, but it's extremely deep and complex. You'll constantly be doubling back to hidden areas and locked doors throughout the game as you gain more keys and more powers. There are plenty of phenomenon that just don't make sense on first pass, but they will when you have more tools at your disposal. At the top of the stairs, we find the seance room, and our worse half. Ed's shadow greets us.
I don't like it any more than you do. Honestly, if I'd known that this would happen when I died, I wouldn't have fought so hard to stick around.
He doesn't tell Ed exactly what he is, but he states that the two of them are now trapped together in the mansion, and they'll have to work together to get out. He insists that for now, we should just try and figure out how the hell we even died. We find Ed's old camera. Not the one he typically used professionally, this was his late father's camera. In death, it has become one of Ed's relics, that he can use to snap spirit photos and access old memories. Using it, we learn a few things. Firstly, we learn that Meadow is a fraud, and the seance is basically just a show to take the gullible billionaire for all he's worth. We also learn our history with Tom. He was a gallery owner who gave our spirit photos to Barclay months before the seance. Ed handed over the photos with the promise of payment later on, but Barclay, cheap and malignant bastard that he is, stiffed us, despite clearly having the money. As the game goes on, I get more and more convinced that Meadow has the right idea. Afterwards, we take a spirit photo of the seance. Somehow, despite the fraud medium's intention, the seance clearly brought forth something. But what that thing is very much unclear. Our shadow promptly says, you know what, fuck this, let's just leave, and honestly, I hate to say it, but he's got good instincts here. We head towards the garden to see if we can hop the fence. On the way, we're forced to do something awful. Willingly enter a pitch black room. Look, you can see through body language alone that my entire being rejected this challenge. To make matters worse, there's something in the dark here with us, and isn't that just awful? The end of the room contains Ed's second relic, his father's old camera flash. We can use it as a flashlight, a way to burn roots, or even stun specters. Once we're in the garden, the game finally starts to become itself. This is the section that most of the reviewers don't make it to. We hear the creature in the garden shuffling about, and weeping about the cold, long before we see her. And soon, we catch a glimpse of her in the distance, shuffling and shivering up ahead. Fortunately, we soon reach the exit to the mansion, but something holds us back. The mansion won't let us leave. This time, the Spectre, which the devs have labeled the sad cinematographer, is shambling all over, and we're forced to remember that Wraith Afterlife is supposed to be a stealth game, and I gotta say, the game makes sneaking to be an absolute terror. It's always terrifying, and it never feels fair. Okay, finally free. No! Oh, thank God. Well, at least are you goddamn kidding me? Eventually, despite all odds, we make it back to the mansion and out of the clutches of the cinematographer. For lack of anything better to do, our shadow suggests that we start gathering up the seance artifacts. If they're gathered, maybe the mansion's ghosts will let us go. And frankly, it's a great idea. This guy here, he's always trustworthy. Tom's knife is nearby. Yes, that's correct. His personal item he brought to the seance was a knife.
How I relax. It's Japanese, top of the line stuff.
Meadow's globe is next. It's just sitting out in the hallway. The others won't be so simple, though. Down a dark hallway, we start rooting around for Barclay's belongings. It is here that we discover the third and final of the minor specters, the Wall Street Whiz Kid. This is one of only a handful of jump scares in this game, but damned if it didn't get me good. Sneaking about this area with the lumbering specter, we find Barclay's voice recorder. With it, we're now able to open voice-activated locks all over the mansion. One of these, under the watchful eyes of the Whiz Kid, is Barclay's occult note, a seance item. In another safe, we also find Alan's film roll. Heading back to Barclay's library, thankfully now clear of the hanged man, we use the flash relic to find Rachel's diary. Our camera was our own seance item, so now we've got everything, and we're able to see what happened at the seance. We clearly summoned something, and Meadow couldn't channel it, because how could she? She was a fraud. There was only one person present who was actually sensitive to ghosts. The photographer. The horrifying specter takes control of Ed. If he had training as a medium, perhaps he might have been able to control it, but he wasn't even aware he was sensitive to ghosts at all. The specter forces Ed to bludgeon Meadow to death for the gall of summoning her. Then, the creature takes out her wrath on her real target, Barclay. The creature appears in the room with us, and it becomes painfully clear that this thing will be after us from now on.
This guy here, he's always trustworthy.
Anyway, the other three flee the seance room, and we head out to see if they survived Ed's rampage. We track them to the guest house in the garden, and after a little exploration, we discover Tom's fate. He begs for mercy, but is soon murdered by his own knights.
Japanese, top of the line stuff.
Something locks us in here, and in response, Ed masters a new arcanoi, the ability to pass through certain walls. In another room, we discover the after image of Ed and Rachel. He couldn't kill her, and managed to excise the spirit temporarily. He begs Rachel to run and hide in Barclay's underground bunker that he apparently humble-bragged about to them earlier. And then, to protect her,
Nope, stop right there. That is probably one of the scenes that got us demonetized the first time. Listen, I bleeped a couple things earlier, I also hit that specter, but I'm pretty sure this was the scene that did it. But I can't really cut this scene because it's very plot important. So instead I will demonstrate using only words that YouTube will allow me to say. So let's pretend for a second that this is a certain Japanese implement, very high quality, helps me relax. And what Ed did was he said,
we try to leave, but Cassandra's power locks us in and traps us in pitch darkness. And worse, we're not alone in the guest house any longer. She's here. Cassandra, the broken woman, always watching you in the dark. And she follows you. This is the most goddamn skin-crawling section of the game. This is the kind of terror that people have been dreaming to design in VR since it was invented. She's there, stalking you while you're forced to evade with a movement speed barely faster than hers, just feeling it in your bones. That she's always there, she could be anywhere. And usually, she is. You have to find your way out of this in the dark, unlocking doors, frantically turning doorknobs while she stalks you, never sure if you'll look over your shoulder and see her lunging at you. We've all seen those scenes in movies where that idiot fumbles with their keys and they can't get the car door open. Well, Wraith Afterlife is a humbling reminder that in a panic, we're all that guy. VR has always had the ability to be more tactile than any other medium. And the panic you feel trying to fumble with a doorknob while the stuff of nightmares is trailing just behind you, I mean, it's skin crawling, truly. I have never experienced something so scary in a video game before. By some miracle, I eventually stumble my way out after a truly harrowing chase through the dark house. I am not ashamed to say that once I got out and to a save point, I legitimately just fell to my knees in real life. When I regained my composure the following day, I went hunting for the basement and the bunker that Rachel supposedly fled to. To get there, we have to go through Barclay's private theater, the sad cinematographer stumbling through to try and catch us on the way through. Arriving on the lowest floor, we receive one final power, the last thing we need in order to have full access to the entire mansion, Wraith Grip. This power lets us manipulate heavier objects than we could before. With Wraith Grip, we solve a quick and easy puzzle before heading down to the bunker. Rachel's voice comes through from behind the door, and it sounds like she's in danger. The power of the broken woman holds the door closed, however, and our shadow tells us that we'll need to find the broken woman's fetters before she'll finally release her grip on the vault. The first fetter, her amulet, is easy. We find it in the elevator on the way out. Number 2 is tough as hell though. The man and the whiz kid team up to protect it in the party room. This isn't the scariest section in the world, but honestly, it might be the most difficult. And when I finally got out, I was exactly this close to death. But I do in the end succeed at getting Cassandra's contract. We then use our new elevator access to get upstairs to Barclay's bedroom and occult research areas. The third object isn't here, but we do find some things of interest. A note from Rachel. Apparently she and Ed were having marital problems. We also find out Barclay's plan. The aging bastard was refusing to die. He wanted to evade death by ensuring that he would become a powerful wraith that could possess other people's bodies. To learn how to do this, he attempted to summon a Wraith Rider through the seance, which as far as I can tell is implied to be the ghost who writes the opening chapters of the core tabletop manual for Wraith the Oblivion, which means Barclay might have found a Wraith the Oblivion rulebook and lost his mind. Additionally, Barclay has a box up here that can destroy spirit world items. Lastly, on Barclay's balcony, we discover what happened to Cassandra.
Today, people know your name. Tomorrow, maybe you're a star. What do you think, Alan? Does she have what it takes to become a star?
There's only one way to find out.
Howard, don't! Stop being such a bitch. Now come over here. What the fuck?
We double back to the garden to see where she fell, and find out that she was alive at the bottom.
Please. Call an ambulance.
Barclay blackmails Alan into helping him cover up the incident, instead of calling an ambulance as Alan wanted. We're directed to the pool house where Alan is staying. We find the third fetter, a prop from Cassandra's movie, and witness the moment when Ed killed the aged movie star. We make it to the basement, and with her fetters as payment, the broken woman allows us to enter the bunker. Inside, we find a note that makes no sense. Rachel had broken up with Ed. His obsession with trying to make it in LA had destroyed their marriage and left them both destitute. She wishes us well selling our soul to Barclay, and tells us that she won't be there when Ed gets back. In the heart of the vault, we find a grave. Barclay and Alan buried Cassandra's broken body alive, while she begged for mercy. It's then that our shadow comes clean. Rachel was never here.
Come on, Ed. Not even you can be that delusional. She left you weeks before the seance. And in case you hadn't noticed, we're all dead here.
The shadow put this in Ed's brain, made him imagine things that weren't there. When Ed finished the rampage, the broken woman let him go. Ed didn't call the police or Rachel or anyone. He just... The shadow tells us that it's done playing with Ed.
Bye-bye, Ed. See you in Oblivion. It was nice knowing you.
We book it out of the vault, broken woman scuttling behind us. With nothing left to go on, Rachel's voice calls out to us, asking us to come meet in the lobby. We find her there, and she gently reminds us that she isn't actually real. She's all in our head, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this moment doesn't have power. Some Wraith the Oblivion characters possess an Eidolon, which is the opposite of a shadow, but these are generally weaker and more subtle than their dark counterpart. This after image of Rachel appears to be Ed's Eidolon, and guides him to find a way to destroy the broken woman's fetters. There was a cursed fireplace in Barclay's office, so we head there first. The broken woman, now unchained and far more dangerous than before, scuttles along the ceiling like a spider. I end up finding a nice sneaky route past the horror, and I manage to burn Cassandra's contract before she can sink her claws into me. We do a similar thing upstairs, in an awful sequence where we need to use the combination on the special box in the upper floor to destroy Cassandra's movie prop while the broken woman hunts us. Fuck, I keep dropping these keys! Finally, she guards the basement now where she never prowled before. She finally catches me, but after all this time, once in the game, finally I manage to succeed at camera flashing a ghost. At Cassandra's grave, the amulet is shattered, casting the broken woman into the Tempest, never to return to the Shadowlands. Our shadow begrudgingly taunts us. We may have defeated his friend at the mansion, but what really was there for us outside of this place? He invited us to go find Rachel and cry about our fate for an eternity. Doing our best to ignore the bastard, we head to the gate, where he appears to us one final time. And he gloats. Because you see, none of this was as it appeared.
Really, Ed? Really? Did you think that was all it would take to defeat me? To banish me from your life? No.
Do you remember way back when I said there were some lore inconsistencies earlier? Specifically the fact that Ed never had a call or a Reaper. That's because none of this is real. Our shadow has been screwing with us. When a shadow and specters team up to break a Wraith's mind, I remind you, that's called a harrowing. Just like Rachel being present for his death, this has all been lies fed to us by our shadow. And now, the shadow remarks, it's time for him to wind back the clock and harrow us once more until we break. Our last sight is the broken woman leaping once more to tear at Ed's mind. The implication, of course, is that this is sort of a time loop. The Shadow and his spectral allies will force Ed to relive this over and over until he's dragged down into Oblivion. This is the standard ending, but there is a true ending where you escape if you manage to 100% the game and find all of the notes and collectibles. But for me, I am happily going to never play a VR horror game ever again, unless there's a sequel to this. But overall, Wraith Afterlife, way past my limit, man. I urge you, if you have an appetite for horror and a VR headset, give this game a go to find out the stories of the minor specters and to see the true ending. Ultimately, this ended up being a really great use of Wraith lore, constructing an utterly terrifying and grim story about the dark side of LA. It was on the more grounded side of things, a story told with restraint. There's no Ghost Godzilla to be found here. I actually think there's some room for the goth punk D&D style of Wraith if this game ever receives a sequel. Although Ed will escape the harrowing in the true ending, the boy is hardly ready to transcend. He's got plenty of heartbreak left to experience if he wakes up and tries to contact the still living Rachel. A sequel about that could expand the lore considerably. I'm unsure if a shadow can harrow a wraith while they are still in the call, but if that is what happened and Ed managed to avoid getting turned into a specter while he was still in the call, then we can start the game with Ed being reaped, and he can continue his doomed journey to find Rachel, and avoid Stygian slavers and malignant specters. Ed was a really good protagonist for a Wraith game. You can see why this guy has unfinished business. He's made terrible mistakes in life, but he's not done anything that makes him irredeemable or unrelatable. Not to mention that his shadow is a really engaging nemesis. Now, this game scared the shit out of me. VR horror is not my genre, so I would be lying if I tried to tell you that I had a tremendous amount of fun with this game, but I will say it is a great piece of World of Darkness media, and it used the Wraith lore in a way that's kind of a dream come true for White Wolf's most tragically unusable game setting. The game isn't perfect, though. You have a health bar that's invisible, and it's not explained very well. You can find photos of Rachel, because she is your fetter, that will restore your health bar, but you actually have very little knowledge if you need healing or not. Also, for a game that requires you to collect a ton of stuff and send it to your memory palace to get the true ending, it sure doesn't have any way to access that memory palace to see what you do or don't have. If you play this and try to 100% it, I'd recommend going to the wiki before you start playing, and make a checklist of all the items and memories you're going to need to find. Lastly, the dowsing rod mechanic is not very accurate, and it's a pain to use. Under every forum post, as well as every Let's Play of this, you're going to find dozens upon dozens of confused players who are stuck and can't figure out how to progress. But in my opinion, all of this can be forgiven, as this is still a great use of an IP that has been begging for a good adaptation for decades. Fast Travel absolutely killed it. With a knife.
Japanese, top of the line stuff.
Alright, one last time, back to Richard Dansky.
Well, I took over Wraith in 1995. The original developer, Jen Hartshorn, had done some incredibly creative work, laid some really strong foundations with the other co-creators of the game. Love Beyond Death was one of her books, and I still think it is one of the most adventurous books ever produced in the medium. And then I picked it up in the summer of 95, did my first couple of books, which were Spectres and Artificers and Dark Kingdom of Jade remotely for the large part. And I got there, and there was some education that had to happen about what was going on the other lines and the continuity of the world. I had been a dedicated vampire player for a while before I started writing for Wraith and Changeling, and then moving down to Atlanta. So I was pretty good on what was going on in Vampire, but I got brought up to speed on the Rasputins and the Sam Hate and all the other stuff that was going on.
A lot of the reputation around the games online is that all of the game lines are like 70% compatible with each other in terms of lore. How much of that was intentional, like not every species or like subsect of the World of Darkness has all the info, versus how much of it do you think was sort of miscommunication?
We communicated pretty well. On a certain level, some of the rules simply were not compatible from setting to setting. So we kind of kludged that a little. But mostly it was, look, Wraiths have their perspective on the universe, and this is how they see everybody else. They don't know the inner workings of this, that, or the other thing. They don't know how the powers work. They just know what they observe. And the same goes for everything else.
All of the different subsects kind of just having their perspectives on the world as it is. Did the team have like a master document somewhere or a general idea of like what's the actual truth? Was that on anyone's minds?
Oh God, no.
No? Okay, so it was just the POV of each.
Oh, if only we had. No. And there would always be these little bits of continuity that sneak in that to other products. You go, wait a minute, if that affects my stuff. Wait a minute.
So Wraith, wow, what an incredible game line! It was treading so much new and unexplored ground in so many ways, even ground that a lot of the rest of the World of Darkness wasn't exploring as much, and especially with the sort of parallel game lines or parallel worlds. I mean, what was it like to be writing kind of in a direction and designing in a direction that was more or less unexplored in tabletop games at the time?
It was glorious. I loved it. The joke I would tell at the time is that I was sort of the Deep Space Nine of the World of Darkness. So, I was off in my own little corner doing my thing. And people weren't looking over my shoulder and saying, "You're doing what?" So I got a chance to do some really crazy experimenting. Stuff with overarching meta plots and continuing characters. And it was a joy. I had a great crew of writers who got what I was doing, and each contributed particular voices and particular tones and particular knowledge bases, and they gave me exactly what I was asking for and more.
Looking at Wraith in retrospect, it's not for every table. It's there's only a small percentage of tables that Wraith is especially good for. But then the weird thing was that even though there were a huge number of tables that didn't feel like the game would work for them, it still ended up being so many people's favorite part of the World of Darkness. And I said it a bunch in my video, but it was because I heard it so much online, is that Wraith is everyone's favorite part of the World of Darkness that they don't play. What do you think of that kind of idea that has passed through time?
There is unfortunately some truth to that. I am glad people think of it as their favorite part of it. I wish more folks had played it. There were definite attempts on my part to extend crossover rules with things like the Risen, so you could get a little taste of Wraith in your vampire, werewolf, or mage, or changeling game. But even so, it's nice to be remembered fondly. One of the things about Wraith, I think, that makes it stand out, even if people don't recognize it immediately, is that it is actually the only one of the core World of Darkness games with hope at the end. There might actually be a way out. There is no way out of the apocalypse. There is no way out of Gehenna. There is, the Autumn people are coming for the changelings. The technocracy is rolling over everything. But there is the possibility of transcendence in Wraith. There is the possibility of taking care of your business, becoming a whole human being, resolving your unresolved issues, and moving on to whatever's next.
Well, okay, I imagine we're down here to like 5% of the original audience. If that, honestly, I'd be pretty lucky if 5% of the people are still watching after what's it been? Oh God! The World of Darkness was a lightning rod, a gothic hurricane that swept the culture of the 90s. It was many, many things to many, many people. But the most important thing it is today, in this day and age, is over. The World of Darkness is over in a few different ways. Firstly, its day in the spotlight is finished. Perhaps it could get back there again one day, but that doesn't seem likely where we're standing in 2024. But it's also over in a narrative sense. As tragic as the game's decline in the CCP era was, it can be difficult to remember that the World of Darkness succeeded. It succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The franchise concluded in a series of end times books that wrapped up the stories and plotlines cleanly. Catastrophically, let's be clear, but cleanly nonetheless. if any system got shafted by the CCP era, it wasn't the World of Darkness. It was the successor games called the Chronicles of Darkness that sought to march on in a reimagined world. Attempts to bring the World of Darkness into the modern day have been mixed. There are a handful of solid new books, a few standout video games, and it's releasing into a tabletop industry that's busier and bigger than it's ever been before. How does the World of Darkness come back? Well, despite all of the effort that's being put in right now, it's possible that it simply never can. The World of Darkness ended. It was finite, tied to the years it was released, a narrative and a world running alongside our own. The World of Darkness might not be a Dungeons and Dragons. The World of Darkness might be a Woodstock. It was an event, one that will be talked about for decades to come and remembered fondly by those who were there. The effects it had on the industry, the people it initiated into the hobby, and the way it changed the way we think of role-playing games will live on, even if the games themselves never do. But this section is devoted to how the World of Darkness can properly return from the dead. While it can't, may be a particularly potent answer, it's still kind of avoiding the question. For one thing, I think we need to understand what that means. What does it mean for the World of Darkness to come back? In a sense, it never left. The Chronicles of Darkness were here the whole time, giving us the themes of the old games but pressing on in new times and without a metaplot. They have ensured that a timeless version of these settings exist and can be played in the modern day. Chronicles of Darkness, however, are not suited to bring back the zeitgeist of the World of Darkness. But that wasn't their job. Their job was to create a version of the franchise that could move forward past the original era it was tied to. What Paradox has been publishing right now in the modern day honestly isn't so much what the World of Darkness originally was. It was a game tied directly to the goings-on in the world, and containing an ongoing plotline that affected every table in that world. No, the new World of Darkness has the same goals and objectives as the Chronicles of Darkness. It's to not get bogged down in an era. It's to avoid cumbersome metaplots and to let playgroups have full authorship over the setting. These new games may have been written with the original lore ported over and updated, but let's be clear. In all ways that matter, this new World of Darkness is just the Chronicles of Darkness 2. It's that style of game, but with new rules and more lore ties to the old games. This approach, if done well, will keep the game alive and in people's memories for a while, but it can never really revive the heart and soul of the World of Darkness. It will never rouse entire subcultures again like this. With this in mind, with this being the situation, I see two ways forward if Paradox was to try again, or if someone else takes a crack at things if Paradox gives up. Each of these two routes prioritizes something different in the soul of the IP, while compromising a little bit on other things. Let's start with what I consider the more realistic of the two paths. The World of Darkness as it stands is completely, intrinsically, one could say tragically tied to the era it was made. It was a 90s game, and if a corporation isn't willing or able to tie it adequately to the subcultures, conflicts, and zeitgeist of today, then the strongest approach may be to just start publishing the World of Darkness as a period piece. Bring back that full metaplot and the countdown to the end times, but put it in a big DM story companion where they can run their groups through the decade, or set games at like different years in the setting and you know exactly what's going on in the story at that time. This approach is very much a compromise. It will let people relive the old World of Darkness as it was, and catch a few fading dark rays off of its original glory. This is also the way that brings the game forward with the lore most intact, which I know for a lot of older fans is the #1 priority. It won't have the same punch behind some of the themes though. In lieu of ties to modern goths and punks, it will instead have to be a love letter to those communities in the 90s, instead of a rallying cry for them now. This may be more palatable for a corporation. Punk especially gets pushback after all, and no corporation wants that heat. But setting the game in the 90s lets games companies write in that punk and gothic style without having to deal with all the controversy of doing it in the modern day. A lot fewer people are going to be upset about you writing grimdark stories set in the world of Bush and Clinton than they are if you're writing a metaplot about the 2024 election. Keeping the World of Darkness set in the 90s is a solid way for a corporation like Paradox to keep some of the soul intact, and also keep the old fans on board. But there is another way. A hard way. To be clear, no major company like Paradox is gonna try this next way. This is only going to be possible if they decide to sell the IP, and it gets purchased by a small or medium-sized TTRPG publishing company. Tying the World of Darkness to the 90s as a period piece preserved the lore, avoided controversy, and also, importantly, avoided pissing off the existing fanbase by not altering the established setting very much. The cost that you give up by doing that, though, is that you give up the potential of capturing that same electric energy of the original, the spirit of rebellion, the feeling that you're playing a game of your time, an ARG tacked onto your life about a world of monsters just like our own. The other approach was great for keeping the lore and the old fanbase intact, but in every World of Darkness book, it doesn't start out by saying that the World of Darkness is for this particular age demographic and contains these stories and these lore beats. No, it says that this fucking book is goth punk. And those aren't just words. Those are living subcultures with belief structures and values. Now, here's how we preserve that, and it's going to be a hard road to do it. For starters, I think they have to prioritize those themes over the original lore. It's likely to be wise to give the system a new name, much like the way that the Chronicles of Darkness did, to show that this is a new universe in the franchise. Let's start with a tough but inevitable truth that the system is going to have to contend with. Folks, we're old. You and me. Look, I've seen my analytics. Around half of us are over 30. Now, I mean, that's not old, but the thing you gotta remember is that OG World of Darkness was a game that was purpose-built to electrify teenage goths and punks. Do you think the original World of Darkness would have caught on if it was written to appeal to us the age we are now? The original World of Darkness was written by rebellious 20-year-olds who were here on their first job and went to the office barefoot. Nowadays, all the leadership on the writing team is literally double that age or more. And this is the part that's going to hurt for a lot of the old fan base. It's easy to love being young and playing a game about rebelling against old, rigid social norms of your parents. But if we want to authentically tie World of Darkness to the modern world, to run a metaplot and themes about the world we live in right now, and we want to meaningfully make it goth and punk, the game is going to rebel against you. We're the old ones now. It's our social norms that we're used to that are now being cast down by the punks. And that's a lot less fun, but it's also very important. If this franchise is to be for Gen Z and Gen Alpha what it was for Millennials and Gen X, then the reins need to be handed over to a very young team of writers, and they're going to write the World of Darkness in a way that's going to make a lot of older fans mad. But the truth is that for some of us, if we didn't have nostalgia for it, well, we might not have liked the original very much either. It was radical, it was counterculture, it was punk. And a lot of us ain't punks, we're nerds. And let's try to remember, that kind of means we're guests in the World of Darkness. We were never meant to be the showrunners. And many in the modern day will remember back when they had more in common with the punk movement, and they'll feel like the punks left them behind, that they've drifted away from the original messaging, but like, it would be weird if they didn't, right? The world has changed, so why would the punks stay the same? They're not rebelling against the same things. Back in the 90s, we lived at what we thought was the end of history, the eternal peace. We had achieved justice and prosperity forever. To be punk was to see the evil still in the world. One of the biggest objectives at the time was just forcing people out of that rut, to wake them up to the fact that history spins on, evil hasn't been solved. Simply confronting people with that evil still here, was an act of rebellion. Having edgy humor in a sterilized world was punk. But things have changed. We don't live in that dreamlike trance of the 90s anymore. You don't need to shock people into realizing the world is bad. Brother, everybody knows now. That's about the only thing we can all agree on. So punks nowadays don't come off as edgy as they used to. Why? Well, because that tactic ran its course. They won on that front. Everybody knows the world is shit. Punks now need to have solutions. It's not just enough to point out problems. We've changed. Punks have changed. But youthful rebellion against older generations lives on. And without it, we can at best preserve the goth part of the world of darkness, but we'll never get back the goth punk. If we loved the spirit of the world of darkness, we have to let it be a game for rebels and outcasts, a game in perpetual rebellion against oppressive systems. We can't let ourselves hold the world of darkness back, just because we've now become the entrenched higher-ups. After all, we've seen how that works for the Camarilla. Is there a market for a game like this? That's the thing. This is a pie-in-the-sky dream. You can restore the soul of gothpunk, put it in the hands of the next generation, but there is still no true guarantee that it's going to catch on. This method is a long shot, and I don't much like the odds that anyone will be bold enough to try it. But I will say to keep an eye on an indie vampire game from this year that is sweeping the tabletop awards, and it's also punk as hell. It's called Eat the Reich, in which you play as vampire commandos dropped into Nazi-occupied Paris. You cannot rest until you have drained the blood of Adolf Hitler. The cover is literally a vampire gnawing at their own coffin, frothing at the mouth for the opportunity to murder fascism. It is not the same vibe as the World of Darkness, but keep an eye on it anyway. It's likely a good yardstick as to just how much appetite is out there right now for supernatural punk media. Well, this has been Around the World of Darkness in 3 video games. It's my first time doing a mega video like this where I rehash some old content and put in bonus stuff. Let me know what you guys think. There's a couple things I've done in the past that could deserve some remastering like this. Specifically, I think it's kind of a shame that I covered my old Ravenloft videos before I had discovered kind of my modern format. But for now, goodbye. Happy month of darkness.